I was car camping with friends on the Oregon coast at a designated site in the woods. While I was carrying firewood, our camp neighbor came up and offered to help, and then introduced himself to the group. We invited him over for a beer, and it turns out his name was Jason, and he was a retired boat cook who used to work on fishing ships in Alaska, but now he's traveling the west coast and staying in campgrounds. Jason was kind of a quiet guy, but as the night went on, he started to get a bit off, acting suspiciously, not really interacting with anyone, staring off into space, and then getting up, walking 2 steps and sitting down again. It started to get pretty late, and we were all getting ready to go to bed. I usually sleep outside in a sleeping bag without a tent unless it's raining or something. So I set up my sleeping bag a little ways away from the fire and pass out. I woke up to Jason standing over me with a weird look on his face and my friends freaking the hell out. It turns out they all thought he stumbled back over to his campsite, but instead he went over to me and started stumbling / trying to roll me out of my sleeping bag. I was super pissed off at this point and tired, and we kicked him out of our campsite while I went to sleep in my friend's tent. Now at this point, I feel that I have to say that these might seem like warning signs, but the Pacific Northwest has some very strange and unstable people, so we honestly didn't think much of it beyond some weirdo getting too drunk and perhaps lost. The next day we all piled into a car to explore the town, and as we leave we see Jason sitting at his campsite, just staring at a lantern across from him. We're gone for about 3 hours, and when we return, Jason is still there, staring at this lantern. We were all making dinner later, when he comes over to our camp with a bottle of vodka and apologized for being so weird the night before. My friend accepted his apology and offered him a burrito, and Jason proceeds to start drinking the vodka and eating with us. Completely different guy. He seems really embarrassed and sorry for the night before. As the night progresses, he's getting quiet again, but I honestly thought at this point perhaps he's just down on his luck. Maybe a touch of alcoholism, and probably pretty harmless. Plus, he wouldn't take a hint to leave. After dinner, I was sitting on a log with my back to the woods, facing the fire, and my friends were all arranged around the campfire on chairs on the other side. Jason was sitting on the log next to me on my right, between me and the group. We're all having a great time and laughing, and as the night goes on, Jason is getting progressively more quiet and seems really angry. Around midnight, I glance over and notice that he's mumbling under his breath. Now I'm the only one close enough to him to sense this change, and I start to try to figure out what he's saying. I follow his gaze and notice that he's staring intently at the axe to the left of me. I didn't want to spook him by moving, but it's about this time that I hear what he's saying, and he's talking about stabbing us all with his knife, over and over again. He's got this really glazed look as he says that he's going to end us. I lock eyes with my friends across the fire, and he notices that something is really wrong and stands up, and I grab the axe and run as fast as I can to the other side of the fire. Jason gets up and starts to run towards us, and my friend, who's a big guy, grabs a hold of him while my other friends take his knife from him. We debated packing up and leaving, but ended up escorting him back to his campsite and sitting in the car until morning when we could report it. The next day at sunrise, when I head over to the camp ranger station, I noticed Jason was completely gone, with all his stuff, even though he'd already paid for 6 more days. I've done my share of deeper backcountry stuff, and seen bears, heard strange noises, and was stalked by a cougar more than once. But to this day, the only experience I've had in the woods that made me wish I had a gun was this one. I must preface this with a few things. This encounter is second-hand, but was told to me on multiple occasions by the person that experienced it. I am a natural skeptic and cynic, so I can't say that I 100% believe it, but his telling of it was pretty simple yet concise, and did not vary between the retellings. I've known this guy for many years, and his advice and input on just about everything is well reasoned and always helpful, so I'll just try to take his word on it, even if with a grain of salt. So let's get down to business. My friend Marv likes to go solitary camping on occasion, to be at one with nature. He is also an avid gun collector and enthusiast. I don't remember exactly when he said that this took place, but it was a few years back, and he decided to go camping on a whim. He packed his gear, a few guns, a hunting rifle, and a .45 sidearm specifically, and headed out into the country onto a vast swatch of property owned by a friend of his. He had full permission in the works. This happened close to the Kisatchie National Forest, in south/central Louisiana. He liked to hike in pretty deep, and camp at specific spots that he found a few trips prior. These details are kind of sparse, as it's not really the meat and potatoes to this encounter. So he made his way in, and set up camp in his usual small clearing for the night. Skipping ahead a few hours, it was now late afternoon, when he heard leaves crunching and twigs being stepped on. He assumed it was an animal at first, and got up from cooking something on the fire to try and get a look. He gazed in the direction of the noise, and saw a man approaching through the trees a good many yards away. He has described his etiquette for dealing with other people in very remote places as always being cautious, as more often than not, the people he comes across are armed like him. He tries to stay friendly, but he still keeps his guard up, looking for any ulterior motives, as you can never tell what some folks are up to in the middle of nowhere. He'll make chit-chat with them, find out generally what they're up to if he can, and occasionally share a meal. He's never really met anyone nefarious as of yet, other than this situation, and maybe one other, but that's a different ordeal. So one thing that sets off small alarm bells for him is that he knows he's the only one with permission to be on this property, and secondly, this guy is not dressed for the location. He says the guy was wearing a white t-shirt, blue jogging shorts, and white socks and sneakers. Mind you, Marv is miles out in the middle of the woods, away from any paths, roadways, houses, or anything really. Nobody is going to casually stroll into his current location dressed like that, unless they are lost or confused. It was early fall, but not quite cool, very normal for Louisiana. So there's a ton of mosquitoes, ticks, and other insects aplenty. You're not going to have most of your skin exposed, if you can help it, deep in the woods. I know that all too well, from personal experience myself. So Marv assumes something might be up, and calls out, "Hey, do you need help with something?" He says it quite loudly, definitely loud enough to be heard. The guy, however, keeps walking, staring directly at him. Marv is starting to get unnerved, and as I said, I know this guy well, and he is as cool as a cucumber in a tense situation. Getting more uneasy as the guy is closing the distance. He gets to his feet and loudly declares, "Hey man, can I help you with something or what?" The guy is now 10 to 15 feet away, standing at the edge of the clearing in the forest. The guy, looking at Marv dead in the eye, speaks and clearly says, "Help me." Marv said he was already starting to actually get worried at this point, because he said the way the guy said this was as if something that didn't exactly know how to talk was saying "help me," or at least that's how he first thought of it. It just didn't sound right. The guy, still unmoving, says, "Help me," again, but this time more emphatic and just really loud. Marv said this is when he was picking up on what was truly wrong about this. He said the timbre of his voice was more female and actually sounded like a recording being played back, and that the guy's lips and mouth movements weren't matching up with the phrase. It was like he was just opening his mouth, emitting the phrase and closing it again. Marv asked, "What do you need help with?" not daring to back up or move whatsoever. The guy, still standing motionless, was staring directly at him and said, "Help me," again, and repeated the phrase another 3 times slowly, but not louder in volume. Marv, now totally unsure of what the hell is going on, interrupts the guy by barking, "Alright, you need to go now unless you actually need my help. Do you need my help or not?" he continues loudly and firmly in tone. The guy didn't miss a beat, and started up with the "help me's" again, and made it as if to take another step in Marv's direction. Marv told me that's when he did the only thing that made sense in the moment, and drew his .45 semi-auto pistol and pointed it at the guy, telling him that he needed to go. The guy started to get more animated and agitated, actually starting to say the phrase louder, over and over, but not stepping closer or backing away. Marv did what he thought was right given his current predicament, assuming he was dealing with an unstable or potentially dangerous individual, and discharged a round into the ground in front of the guy. Now this is where it gets crazy. I'm not kidding. As the guy stops uttering the phrase, he goes silent, and is still staring at Marv full on. He backflips and somersaults into the woods and immediately out of sight. Yes, you heard that right, just like a gymnast. Now I know what you're thinking, because I had the same reaction. This sounds completely made up for sure, but Marv gave me no indication of falsehood, and told me this on multiple times, each time in a dead serious demeanor. Yet, Marv said the guy backflipped away effortlessly, as if pulled by an unseen tension coil. He described it as completely humanly unnatural, and totally out of place. The guy had just appeared and repeated the same phrase over and over, eventually almost becoming frantic, before Marv shot at the ground, causing him to flee, in the most peculiar manner. Marv said he stood there focused on the forest where the guy just flipped into, and saw and heard no further movement. It was like the guy had never been there. He stayed like this as the sun began to set, and the normal night noises crept in. As I mentioned before, Marv is a pretty unshakable fellow, and actually stayed in the area for the night, and next night, before returning with no further incident. When he has told me and some other friends about this, of course we ask many questions. We prod him to elaborate on the guy's speech sounds. He said the more he thought about it after the incident, the more he was sure it was definitely a female's voice coming from the guy. It was almost like he/it had heard someone say it, and mimicked it like a parrot or any other talking bird would. almost like a lure. He doesn't know what it wanted, and didn't give any indication to follow or utter anything else. It reacted immediately to the gunshot, and you know what follows there. He's been back to the property since, with no other strange occurrences. The only other minute detail that I can think of is that he did remember hearing during the early morning of the first night what sounded like a gunshot off in the distance, and it did sound eerily similar to his .45. He thought he may have heard it again on the hike back. There are people that hunt in the area, and of course it could have just been that, so he couldn't be sure. Since this incident, and one other he had in a completely different location, he did some online research of the whole Kisachi area, and found many legends, stories, and supposed encounters dealing with skinwalkers and other unnerving bits of Native American folklore in the area. Not to mention mimics and other similar supposed creatures. A lot of his encounters line up with these tales, but there's nothing tangible to prove it. But even as a skeptic, it does make me wonder about strange things in the remote and untouched areas of the world that can't be explained. This happened very recently. My mother and I were driving down the road to the woods so that we could take our puppy for a walk and then post some letters in the village. When we were coming back, it was just starting to get dark, but there was still a good deal of light, and I could see fine without my headlights on. For reference, I live on a hill in a very rural area, and as I was driving, I was coming towards my house, which is right on the bend of the road as you come up. There are 2 brick sheds on the left as you approach, which we use, which are across from the lane of my house. There is another lane that runs up the side of my house, which is straight on as you drive up the hill. I have to park a few yards away from my house due to the limited space. So when I come home, I turn right to pass my house, drive down to the barn, and turn around and then drive back up to park besides the road, so that my car is easier to get out of the space again. It's also important to note that these roads are very rarely used by anyone who isn't a neighbor, due to the fact that I live on a private estate, and neither of these roads actually lead anywhere. Anyway, I was driving up the hill with my mum, sitting with the dog in the back, as he's a puppy and we hadn't got a cage for my car yet. I also had a bag full of logs in the boot for the wood stove. As we're coming up the hill, I see what I think is my stepdad walking from one of the sheds across the lane and to the house. When I see him, I mention to my mum that it might be better if she got out of the car right outside the house with the dog and ask my stepdad to take the logs out so that I don't have to carry it all the way up the lane to the house. But then, as we get to the house, we realize 2 things. 1, my stepdad's car is not parked outside the house where it usually is, nor is it parked anywhere else down the lane. And 2, we just saw my stepdad on the way home, finishing up some work he was doing for our landlord. So, who exactly was the person we just saw? As I'm driving down the lane to turn around and park as I usually do, I'm thinking about the person I saw, and am trying not to freak out. It was definitely a man. There was just something about his physique, tall and lanky, and the way he walked, kind of like a swagger, that just made it seem like it was a man and not a woman. He was wearing a black hoodie with the hood up, so I couldn't see his face, as well as a pair of camouflage trousers. This is not the kind of thing my stepdad would wear, not least because he actually doesn't even own any clothes like that. He's also not lanky and doesn't swagger, so it clearly could not have been him. Anyway, we get parked and walk up to the house with the dog and the wood, and then come to the door. The door is unlocked. At this point, my mother is getting very anxious, because even though she did not see the person, she's concerned, because she definitely locked the door behind her. She's borderline paranoid about locking the door, even though we live in the back and beyond, so I believe she locked the door. So she thinks that we might have been mistaken, and for whatever reason my stepdad got a lift home from work and unlocked the door himself. She opens the door and calls out his name, but there's no answer. She hears a bang coming from upstairs that sounded like something was falling off the bed. She tells me to use my key to lock the door, because now it seems someone is actually in the house. I locked the door and ran over to the tool shed to grab a hammer or something. I couldn't find the light switch, so I just grabbed the Stanley knife on the table and ran back with it. My mum told me not to use it, because I could get into trouble for using it on someone, even if they were burgling the house. But I was scared out of my wits, and had read far too many creepy stories, so I kept it in my hand regardless. My mum phoned my stepdad, and told him that there was someone in the house, and he effectively told her to stop panicking because it was unlikely. She explained that I saw someone walking out of our shed, and then she heard something upstairs. At first, he thought we had actually seen him, but he couldn't have returned by the time we got home because we passed him near our landlord's house as we were driving back. He said not to worry, and that he would be back in a minute, and my mother hung up. As she unlocked the door, she told me to wait outside with the dog, and that she would go investigate. I followed her inside with the wood and the dog and the knife, and stood at the front of the stairs as she went to look up. I checked the cupboard and the corner of the dining area and found nothing. Once she came downstairs and found nothing, we relaxed a bit, or she did. I was still freaked out, because I had no idea what I had just seen. I too went upstairs to double check. I looked under the beds and in the cupboards, but it was to no avail. I was still freaked out though. I definitely saw someone. So considering it wasn't my stepdad, there were only a few possibilities now. One of my neighbors came over, went into our shed and disappeared into thin air. That must be the case, because they can't access it via their property on the road. I'd just driven down and saw nobody. Or our other neighbor's son who has schizophrenia. He used to be in the army and also wears camo sometimes, and he has a history of wandering around our neighbor's yard and following my neighbor around. Maybe he decided to go into our shed. This was later ruled out when my stepdad got back, because he told us that he knew my neighbor's son was now living in a home for the mentally ill just down the coast. Also, this neighbor's house is at the end of the same street I'd just driven down, so I would have seen him walking down the lane as I drove past to that neighbor's house, turned around and drove back up to park, and I didn't see him or anyone else for that matter. The only explanation is that someone came looking for my stepdad and then walked off somewhere we couldn't see. But I don't know, that'd be really weird. The only road used frequently is the one I drive down. The one other road, which was very rocky and unpaved, that leads to the barn, there's literally nothing at. So I don't know why anyone would go down there. Also, I could see right down this road when I was coming up the hill, and that person literally just disappeared behind my mum's car, where the front door is. As for the bang my mum heard, I honestly think that was just the cat jumping off my bed upstairs. But in the moment it was scary, because I'd also seen someone walking across the lane to the house, and the adrenaline was pumping. I really don't know what it was. I do know the figure was solid enough for me to think it was an actual person. I also know this isn't the first time we have seen and heard unexplainable things in our house. 2 days after we moved in, my mum and I both heard what sounded like my voice downstairs saying, "Oh, what?" And we both thought that the other had said it. I don't sound like my mum at all, really. But when you hear a female voice, your brain kind of makes sense of it and assumes it's the only other person it could be, which in my case was my mum. It was only after I found out that it wasn't my mum that I thought back to the sound and realized it really sounded more like my own voice than hers. My mum has also seen a very solid looking cat, a totally different coloured one to R2, walking up to the door as if it was going to go out the cat flap, and then no cat flap sound. When she went to look, the cat was not there, or outside, and both our cats were still upstairs. She's also seen a small white dog appear out of nowhere and seemingly disappear, and saw someone's arms pulling out the drawers of her dresser when she was outside looking into the bedroom window. She assumed it was my stepdad, only for him to tell her that he hadn't even got out of bed yet. What creeps me out about this one is that my stepdad's workmate has seen someone walking out of our shed before too. He came to pick him up for work one time and was waiting by the house when he saw what he thought was my stepdad come out of the shed, walk through the gates beside it, and disappear behind the building. When my stepdad then walked out of the house, he was obviously pretty surprised. I've had many encounters with ghosts, but this is the first time I've seen a solid apparition in this place. Considering that the house is probably about 400 to 500 years old, I guess it's not that weird. Plus, there's a story of a former resident who was a gameskeeper, having shot himself a few decades ago, which would explain some stuff, like maybe the camo trousers. I'm not sure, but I'm really freaked out. This happened to me just last weekend. After a bucket list road trip with a friend, Eric, to Palm Springs/Mount Jacinto, we were now heading back home to Southern California. I fell asleep on the drive back, since we've been up since 6 a.m. and left Palm Springs around 1:30 p.m. so that we could get home before rush hour traffic, and I was really exhausted from hiking. The drive home was just short of 2 hours through the main freeways. Eric decided to stop by an AM/PM gas station around an hour in from our drive, and since I fell asleep, I couldn't remember from which exit we were coming from. But I think we were somewhere near Murrieta and Rainbow. I remember there was a Target or shopping mall near the gas station. As I was getting up, I could hear Eric talking to someone as he was pumping gas. Apparently, a teenaged transient came up to him begging for a ride, saying he got let out by his family and just needed a lift a few blocks down the road. I could not hear clearly the conversation, but as I focused my vision, I could see a homeless kid walk around the car towards the passenger side door to talk to me for permission. I was locking my door when I saw the homeless kid come round the corner. He really wanted to get into the car. I didn't see much of the kid's face, but from what I could tell, he was a white teenaged kid between 17 to 19, with black hair, who wore all black, had a backpack and a cell phone. He strongly smelled of weed and pee. Eric panics. At least, This is how he explained it to me, and told the kid that he would give the kid a lift since it was only a few blocks down. I was already giving Eric silent dagger stares as he got back in the car. Homeless kid got into the back seat behind me. The moment the homeless kid got into the car, his attitude took a turn for the worse. He started talking weird. He tried to sell us drugs or weed and kept asking questions directed to Eric, though enthusiastically about porn or shooting a porn, getting girls and where he could do casting calls. He also told us that our car was trash, as the back seat was filled with camping gear. He asked us where we went, and told him with little specifics that we came back from camping. He then tried to convince Eric about shooting a porn film. After we passed several streets and exits, every time we would ask him where to drop him off, he would mumble and say, "Keep driving," in a low tone, before being all happy and excited again. The homeless kid took notice of Eric's Beat headphones that happened to be around his neck, and made several attempts to trade it for weed. Now, I can tell that homeless kid was sensing that I was not too happy about the situation, and apparently could see my facial expressions of about to cry/scared from the passenger side mirror, to which he asked in a dark and serious tone, "Why are you acting weird?" He became silent from this point, and when asked again as to where we can drop him off, he responded back with, "Keep driving." This happened several times. We asked him as we passed a street or exit. I was no longer having this, and was scanning the highway/freeway for a good escape plan. I was worried this kid was a dealer, as he had a cell phone and probably would be leading us to his cellars, and worse, get jumped. This kid could also easily point a knife around my neck from the back seat and keep us hostage. First thing I did was quietly kicked my purse underneath my seat and kept my hands down where he could not see from the side mirror. I saw a crowded exit where I can tell there was a populated gas station and signaled to Eric to drive there, which, thank God, he did. The homeless kid asked why we were stopping there. I lied and said that we needed to grab something from the gas station. As we pulled up, I noticed there was a crowded diner next to the station and signaled Eric to park there. More people equals more witnesses equals more help if things go south. We told the kid he needs to get off as nicely and as firmly as we could. He got annoyed, but Eric kept distracting him with the prostitution talk, which he would turn all happy about, and even say that he would pay Eric $5,000 if he needed some women. This finally got the kid out. Now the car Aaron drove was an old manual and does not respond fast enough as we were leaving the parking lot. In fact, it stalled for a good 10 to 15 seconds or so before Eric could get it running, which at the time was in the back seat to check if he may have swiped some valuables. Since the car was not fast enough, I can see the kid was not too happy with him being dropped off and was glaring at me. Then he started to contact someone on his phone. This all happened within the span of 10 minutes, which I felt was an eternity, and I seriously thought I would end up in a ditch somewhere. Unfortunately, this triggered very bad memories for me, because back in college I was able to get away from an assault, and all my anxiety from that experience came back 200-fold. Once me and Eric were back on the Maine freeway, I pretty much released my frustration on him for putting us in possible danger. Anyone who knows my friend Eric knows he's not a huge risk taker, is never trusting of strangers, and is not very social for him to help out hitchhikers, so that's very unlikely for him. Eric explained to me that the homeless kid's personality was different when he first spoke to him at the gas station. He seemed genuinely desperate for a ride home, was about to cry, and even offered money for the lift. This seems to be a lie, as he tried to solicit money from us during the drive. Eric said if he'd have known that the kid would have acted all schizo, he would have never let the kid in the car, but he panicked when he thought he was about to grab, approach me. Eric at least admitted that he messed up big time, but what pissed me off was how he kept telling me that it's done and acted all okay after the incident, but I seriously wanted to kick his butt. Now Eric isn't a very street smart individual, so I had to tell him a bunch of MOs, most robberies / assaults of crazy hitchhikers or drug dealers used to lure their victims, stemming from lost kid excuse, missing a ride, and I even pointed out the kid had money and a cell and could have easily called for a taxi or catch a bus. It was most likely the kid was either high or crazy and possibly a runaway, which I hope he was, rather than a drug dealer luring us to his cellars to get robbed / jumped, and we got lucky. I even scared Eric, saying we were lucky no other cars were following us back home. But it was another hour drive on the Brizzy freeway and back roads, so even if the crazy kid had accomplices, I hope they gave up. Either way, this experience rattled me badly, and I barely slept that night. When we got home, as if fate was telling us how lucky we were, every commercial or ad we saw on the TV showed either trailers or movies about Split, the guy who took 3 girls in their own car, or ads about the fails of hitchhiking. I made sure to point this out to Eric, who sadly seemed indifferent about what happened. It's been 2 days now, and I've had nightmares about the incident and have been jumpy. For now, time will tell when I will be fine again. I do have another road trip coming up with Eric, and hopefully more friends, but I plan to buy some pepper spray for the trip just in case. I also told Eric that I will call the shots on where to get gas and brush up on street-smart safety procedures. Hopefully, this is a lesson for Eric, to not pick up crazy hitchhikers. When my daughter was about a year old, we moved into a 2-story townhouse, kitchen and living room downstairs, bedrooms upstairs. One day, when I was walking from the living room to the kitchen, I saw what looked like a large black cloud in the middle of the room that quickly disappeared into the ceiling. I brushed it off as my eyes adjusting to the light in the room and forgot about it. But shortly thereafter, I started noticing my daughter would sit in the middle of the kitchen and babble away like she was talking to someone. And almost every night, she would wake up at 2 a.m. and start chattering away. After watching something on TV, I decided that maybe it wasn't just a lot of random events, and maybe there was something there. One day, I stood in my bedroom, introduced myself, and said that if there was someone there who wanted to communicate with me, I would listen. The next day I woke up to a tapping in the room. It took a few minutes to find the source. The corner of a poster hanging on the wall was being pulled out a few inches and then let go, so that it would hit the wall. No AC on, no open windows. I laid there and watched for a few minutes, then decided I was too chicken to respond, and ran out of the room. A few nights later, I woke up with the feeling of someone being in the room with us. The room was pitch black, which is unusual since we had a nightlight in the bathroom in case we had to get up with the baby. I looked at my clock to see if the power had gone off, but it was still working. Once my eyes adjusted a little more, I could see a moving mass in the doorway, like a black cloud but moving. I put the covers over my head and pretended it wasn't there, but didn't wake up my husband, who didn't know anything about the other experiences either. Later that week, my daughter wakes up at 2 a.m, chatter time, but this time she is screaming. One night I fell asleep on the couch downstairs and woke up to my husband thundering down the stairs. He tells me he woke up feeling like something was watching him and saw a mass of black smoke in the doorway. He ran through it on his way out of the room and said it felt like electricity. A few minutes later, the baby started screaming. This continued for weeks. The screaming every night, feeling like someone was watching us, seeing black blurs out of the corner of our eyes. In November, I found out my grandmother was dying. The day that I received the call was the last sleepless night we had. It was almost like it took pity on us and left us alone. This isn't the only experience I've had, but they always seem to center around my daughter. She's 14 now, and I have encouraged her to retain her ability to talk to and see things that most people cannot. One evening, when I was 15 years old, I was at home alone. My brother was at a football game, and my mum and dad had just left to eat dinner out. I decided I wasn't hungry enough to warrant going out with them, and settled for them just bringing me home takeout. My parents hadn't been gone longer than 10 minutes. I was sitting in the living room on my laptop, when suddenly, I heard the sound of a car door slam. I glanced at the clock in surprise, because I knew there was no way my parents were back this early, unless they forgot something and turned around. So I sat my laptop down and got up to go investigate. I gently pulled one singular blind down to peep out of the bay window in the kitchen that overlooks our driveway. It's twilight outside, so it's nearly dark, but still enough natural light hanging in the sky from the sun that I could make out a 4-door car, not my parents' car, parked alongside the flower bed at the top of our long driveway. It has shrubs and trees that you could park on the other side of and have trouble noticing a car behind them. As my eyes rested on the car, I saw 3 men. I'm assuming they were all men, because of their stature and size, wearing all black, and masks concealing their faces. All exit the car together and start advancing towards the house. One branches off to cover the front yard and thus the front door. The second branching off to go behind the house, which leads to the back door that leads into our garage, which leads into our house. The third guy, however, was cutting across the yard heading to the side door, the one which I was currently standing next to. I snapped my head back and let the blind fall back into place, my heart doing a flip. I took a split second to process where I planned to hole up inside the house, so I would have the best chance of escaping. I chose my parents' bedroom because it's on the main floor right off the kitchen, and right past the back corridor that leads to the garage. I knew it was also a risky place, as it had 2 doors right outside their bedroom, that 2 of the 3 seen villains were currently heading to. But I wanted to hear and know where my opponents were, the moment they entered the house. I nearly ripped their bedroom door off its hinges when I grabbed it and slammed it shut to lock it. I leapt across their bed and grabbed the phone and frantically started calling my parents. I called them first, because I'd figured they'd be right down the road and would turn around and make it to the house in time to scare these creeps, but they didn't answer. I dialed my cousin who lives up the road 2 houses away, again because of the same reasoning of him being here so quickly. During all of this, my frantic, panicked mind didn't even think to dial 911. I finally got my cousin to answer, as I started to hear bangs at the door outside the bedroom. I knew before my cousin suggested that I needed to arm myself, in case they broke into the house before he got there. I threw the phone down and took a deep breath before I slung the bathroom door open, knowing I was going to have to muster the courage to make a mad dash across the kitchen and grab the biggest butcher knife we owned, passing the doors on the way. As I passed by the narrow corridor that leads to the door connecting the garage and the house, I couldn't help but glance over to the door which had a window. There, I saw a man who chose to break off towards the back of the house. He had broken into the garage via the side door that leads from the outside to the inside of our garage. He was in my garage and staring at me just a few feet away, with only a flimsy pane of glass between us. My heart felt like it cut off. I had never had such a narrowing sense of dread in my life. I quickly whipped my head back towards the kitchen and bolted to the other side of it, throwing myself into the drawer and tearing through it to grab a knife. As I raced back towards my parents' bedroom, I could hear the man at the side door banging on it, and I could hear a guy banging at the front door, but no noise from the guy at the garage door. In that moment, I didn't care about anything but barricading myself in my parents' bedroom until I heard my cousin's truck. To this day, I'll never know what happened, but by the time my cousin got there, not 2 minutes after I initially called him, those guys were gone without a single trace. I didn't hear their car door slam as I did before. I didn't hear an engine crank. Nothing. But when I heard the familiar sound of my cousin's truck rush into my driveway, I mustered the courage to peek out of my parents' bedroom. I noticed none of the doors were open or had been forced open. When I realized I could come out, I went outside and found nothing. Cops had been called during this time. I'm assuming my cousin called them after hanging up with me, and I remember vaguely standing there frantically shaking with a butcher's knife still in hand. The cops, I could tell, were confused and possibly didn't even believe my story. In that moment, I even started to question it. I know what I saw. I know what I felt. The terrifying knowledge that someone was after our house. The paralyzing fear of knowing that you are about to experience hand-to-hand combat with a criminal. The heart dropping. Adrenaline surging rush. All of it. It was real. Those men were there, and for whatever reason I will never know or understand. After the guy in the garage saw me, they decided to book it out of there. Maybe they didn't realize I hadn't left with my parents and had been scoping the place and thought we'd left. Maybe they didn't want to commit to the crime with someone home because they thought it would make too much extra trouble. Maybe they were fathers and couldn't stand the thought of harming a child. To this day, the reason as to why they chose to leave me peacefully are what haunts me just as much as the event itself. Either way, to the 3 men who bum-rushed my house when I was 15, let's not meet again. At my old school, there were maintenance tunnels under it. There were new ones and there were old ones that the school didn't use anymore. My friend Chloe and I found an entrance to the old tunnels in a classroom that wasn't being used. We had to pick a lock on a trap door, unscrew a round metal top, and lower ourselves into a square, dirty tunnel. The main tunnels were about 2 feet wide by 3 feet tall, with maybe 2 inches of dirty black water in the bottom. The tunnels were very dark and cold, and smelled of mold. We began exploring it little by little every day. One day we were in there for maybe 20 minutes, then Chloe passed out. Turns out there were some dangerous gases down there. I had to drag her out. Next time, we brought masks and a flashlight, and began mapping out the system. We tracked more than 700 feet of twisting, turning tunnels, and they went down and turned to the sides. We used chalk to mark the walls so that we could find our way back, and after a particularly long expedition of perhaps 3 hours, we headed back to where we came in, only to find it locked. We pushed and turned the metal cover, and it didn't budge. We were trapped in. We rushed through the tunnels, trying to open each of the 3 openings we had found over time. None of them would open. Any panic that we had now surfaced, and to say the least, we were kind of freaking out. We ended up heading down a tunnel we hadn't been down before. After a while, I kept hearing noises behind us. I told Chloe, who was crawling in front of us, and we froze, turned off our flashlights and listened. Sure enough, a steady splashing sound was following us. We freaked the hell out and made a run for it. Keep in mind we had no idea where we were going at this point, and after maybe 10 minutes of a panicked dash through the tunnels, tripping over pipes and scraping our knees, we emerged into a bigger room. What the hell? We realized it wasn't a room, but a sort of down section of a much bigger room. We had come out in the drainage section of the boiler room. Now you might think our adventure stopped here, but it didn't. This was the second Friday of the month. There was someone doing maintenance down here. We hid behind some old metal stairs, and when the guy left for more tools, we scrambled up the stairs and out the door, and hid in the girls' locker room for the rest of the day. We never did find out who locked us down there, or what that splashing noise was, but perhaps we don't want to know. My mum and dad split up when I was about 2. My dad eventually ended up with his current wife, my stepmother, and they moved quite far away. Me and my older brother Bob would go up and see him once a month. When he first moved away, he lived in this big house that was set out really odd. You'd enter the house into a tiny hallway, with the front room on the right, a dining room to the left. You'd walk through the dining room to the kitchen, which had the back door to the garden, as well as having the bathroom and toilet attached to the kitchen. Super weird. Upstairs was my dad's bedroom to the right, above the front room, and to the left was a really long hallway. About halfway down the hallway was my brother's room. To the left, if you were just walking down the hallway. And at the end, you came face to face with the door to my room. So, the story goes that the place was haunted. I was reasonably young, about 11 or 12. They didn't want to tell me about it because they thought I'd get scared, which I understand. I found out later of the things that had happened to them whilst in the home. My stepmother had an incident where she was in her bedroom doing her hair in the mirror. She looked up in the mirror and saw a young girl standing behind her with her arms crossed over her chest. My stepmother squealed, closed her eyes, and put her head in her hands. And when she looked up, the girl was gone. There were plenty of other instances of doors opening and closing, footsteps up and down the long hall, knocking about in the attic as well as the dogs acting strange, and we had 2 huge Rottweilers. One day I was staying the weekend, and I felt really sick. My family had made plans to go out, but I didn't feel up for it. They decided to leave me at home on my dad's PC in the care of the dogs. They didn't want to let me be alone, in case something happened. While I was playing on the PC, the dogs went really weird. They were normally quite docile, really friendly and extremely loving. Well, they started running about the front room barking. Every once in a while, they would stop and just aggressively growl at the fireplace. I stopped and tried to calm them down, but as I knelt next to them, one of them turned and bit me on the face. He was immediately apologetic, licking and whimpering, whilst asking for cuddles, but I was scared and hurting a bit. He didn't even break the skin, so it wasn't a bad bite, and I felt like I was going to puke. I ran to the bathroom, and the family got home. I told them what happened and they looked really concerned, but told me not to worry and to keep an eye on us. A little something about my room. It was dark and really small. It had a tiny window as well as 2 huge wardrobes in the corner. I never really felt comfy in that room. I hated being able to see the bedroom door, and I have no idea why. I often read in bed, and then try to sleep on the floor, which is really odd now that I think back on it. I couldn't get comfy on that bed, and always had an impending feeling of unsafe. Later that night, we all went to bed. Now, I like to read before going to sleep, so I was reading to myself as I was slowly drifting off to sleep when the bedroom started screaming. I know that sounds bizarre, but there was just this insanely loud scream coming from the room. I had no idea what was going on, so I immediately panicked. Who wouldn't? I tried to open my door and it wouldn't budge. I could hear my brother on the other side of the door also trying to open it, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. The scream was just too loud. I heard thumps outside the door, and I had no clue what was happening and just kept trying to open the door whilst crying. Suddenly the screaming stopped, and the door opened. My brother, dad, and stepmother were just standing there staring at me. I was sobbing. Then my brother hugged me, and my dad asked me why I was screaming and whether I saw the girl. I said I wasn't, and my brother confirmed that he could hear me saying, "What?" throughout the screaming. I stayed in my brother's room that night. The next time I went to my dad's, he had moved homes. I heard the other stories years later. I'd hear other stories about the fireplace being pulled out and things being found. But to be honest, they sounded a bit far-fetched to me. I know this story might sound it too, but I know it happened because I lived it. I am 23 now, and the time that this occurred was my first summer out of high school. And me and my 3 friends, fresh off their freshman year of college, decided to live together. One of my friends, my best friend for years, Earl, had a long-time girlfriend whose father owned the property. It was a decently sized plot of land with several old cabins on it, their house, which was large and out in the back of the woods, and a few other scattered buildings. I think it used to be a campground before he bought it to live on it and run his business out of it. We live in southern Maine, and the property is heavily wooded. Pine Tree State for the win. The house that we lived in was at the very front of the property, right on the road. The owner's house was at the very rear and could only be accessed by a dirt road with 2 ditches on the side. A 1-minute walk towards the woods from our front house was a small little cabin across a clearing, and it was furnished and powered. In the house was me, Earl, John, and Chuck. We all had some different girls and girlfriend pals and partied through the summer. We would frequently come here to the cabin and the owner's house before moving in. Anyway, enough with the scene setting. Some of this story is from word of mouth from the others living in the home, but we have all been friends a long time, and I trust them implicitly, and I witnessed enough myself to know that this all lined up. So, the first encounter was at the very beginning of summer, before we even moved in. It was evening and dark, and everyone was at the owner's house watching a movie. As I slowly drive my car down the dirt path to the owner's, something white and large in size ran in front of my car. It was a blur. It was too fast to really catch what it was, but being in the woods I assumed it was some kind of albino fox. I shrugged it off and made my way to the house. A week later, we were all situated and moved into the front home by the street, and things were great. I'll admit the front area of the property was spooky, despite being the most open and least wooded. The owner's mother had lived in our house and died years ago. We could see an old statue of Mother Mary off in the woods that was always kind of sketchy. Across the street was a small independent tire shop with a small dirt lot. Only thing in the house when we moved in was some kind of antique cheetah statue, which appeared to be from the 60s, tall and skinny in a sitting position, and went up to mid-waist. So we put it in the corner of the hallway. Thought it was neat and retro. For a few weeks all was normal. Admittedly, some friends experimented with some different substances, like LSD and salvia once or twice, paired with the normals like drinking. I do not believe this impacted what happened though. We have some parties, invite girls over for some fun, jam out on the guitars in the cabin. It was a great time. But things slowly became tense and went downhill. A lot happened, and I believe that they are all connected, even though they seem disjointed and random. After a few weeks of fun, Earl had developed crippling insomnia due to some tooth pain that unfortunately he could not afford to fix. He would clock maybe 1 hour of sleep per night, and slowly became more and more irritable, but nothing too serious. One night, John and Earl and some of their friends, who we will call Don, are out back in the cabin. They had done some slight drinking, but John was a straight edge who never touches anything of any kind. Earl is playing on his guitar and singing some of our original tunes. This portion of the story, until I came into play, is recanted by John. During the night, our fourth roommate Chuck is asleep in bed, while I'm in my room, as Earl plays his guitar, and he says to Don, "Wow man, those are some great harmonies you're doing. Since when can you sing?" Don looks a little confused and tells Earl that he wasn't singing along. Earl starts singing again, but stops when he hears the harmonies a second time. He thought his ears were tricking him, but John and Don had heard them too. They put the guitar down and decide to investigate. They walk through the clearing briefly, startled by Mother Mary in the woods, until they reach the front of the road. From across the street they see the biggest white cat they'd ever seen. Not just a cat, but the size of a larger dog or mountain lion. They scramble to try and get a video with their phones, at which point I see them out the window and run down to meet them. As I hit the yard, I'm just stunned as they are, and see this giant white bobcat sitting on a hill across the tire shop. It's massive, about the size of a German shepherd. But something was wrong. Its tail. It had a gross, nasty, fleshy tail, as if it had the tail of a rat. It's long, so I can't see all of it, but it's definitely proportionally wrong and way longer than a normal cat, let alone fleshy and bald. Don picks up a rock and throws it at it. I kid you not, all four of us, two fully sober, watching this thing stand up on its hind legs and calmly walk into the woods, dragging its tail behind us, and we book it inside. Earl is more sleepless than normal, trying to drink himself to sleep. He is successful and Don does the same. I don't remember how John and I fell asleep that night. Every creak of the house petrified me. The next morning we wake Chuck up and thoroughly scare him. We're all kind of on edge for the rest of the day, but with the sun out, the fun starts back up, and we put it to the back of our minds. Today, Earl confides in me about his lack of sleep, and how he does not expect this experience to help. Night comes again, and everyone decides to have a low-key evening after all the excitement from the evening prior. That evening, Chuck suffers from his first and only night terror of his life. He's awake in his bed, and he's in some kind of paralysis, and he hears the growls / snarls / screams of a cougar-type creature or bobcat as a giant white mass runs across the doorway of his room. He slowly regains movement and comes into my room to tell me what happened. He doesn't sleep for the rest of the night, and the next morning we bring the cheetah statue into the cabin from across the clearing. For another few weeks, nothing tremendous happens. We continue to be on edge, and Earl slips a little further, but things are slowly getting better. I do a little research about what we've seen: cryptozoology, demons, and monsters. Finally, I make a breakthrough. I find an article, nothing big, from an old book about Maine urban legends. The book was from a while ago, and described something called the Ding-Ball Cougar, or Plunkus. It just sounds better as Plunkus. Anyway, I said Ding-Ball was a cougar, whose last tail joint was ball-shaped, and bare of hair and flesh. Ding-Ball was fond of human flesh, and would sing with a human voice to lure the incautious out of their cabins at night, where it waited in the dark to crack their skulls with its tail. My heart stopped as I read this, because it matched so well with our experience. Mind you, it said nothing of walking on its hind legs or being white, but the similarities still shocked me, and I kept this info on my chest for a while. A few days later, Earl's insomnia came to a head. It would be about 10 p.m, and I laid in bed before I heard a massive crash. From the audible vantage point I was at, it sounded like someone had fallen down the stairs. I rushed into the hallway as Earl came from his room, and I yelled, "What the hell was that?" Earl turned to me and raised his fist and said, "Shut up, man," and ran down the stairs. I sat in my room for a minute confused, and after about 20 minutes I went to my car and drove to my parents to spend the night. I stayed the rest of the day with my parents too. That night, Earl called me to apologize. The crashing had come from his room, where he had angrily kicked a chair due to oral pain. And when I came out, he thought I was angrily yelling, "What the hell was that?" to him. We made up on the phone, and then he asked me something peculiar. "Hey man, did you come home today at all?" "No, why?" He explained that he was the last one out, so he had to lock the doors, as we had been for about 2 weeks since we all started freaking out. Earl had the only key. "Okay, and?" I asked. He sounded a little scared when he said this. "The cheetah statue was on top of Chuck's bed. I told him not to touch it." Even later that night, when I got back to the house, Chuck's room was closed, and we went and took a look. The cheetah had been placed in the center of Chuck's bed, standing up. He had a lumpy mattress, and the fact that it had stood so straight was impressive and unnatural. It was not leaning, tilted, or anything. As soon as I touched it, it fell over, and the next day I took it and hid it somewhere no one else could bother to look for it. In one of the older cabins, where they only use for storage. The thing is, the next night, it was back in Chuck's room. The bed was made up neatly, and the cheetah was placed under the blankets with its head out, as if it were taking a nap. We burned the statue the next day. I wish I could say that solved everything, but it didn't. Over the next few weeks we continued to be stalked by white blurs in the corner of our vision, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional faint whisper of singing in the distance. At one point, the Mother Mary statue was even turned backwards, no longer facing the home. I'm not sure when, but we only noticed at this point. A few days passed and summer was up, and we all left. We still visit different spots of the property, but avoid that house. We hear the occasional rustle, but we don't watch for colour anymore, because we don't want to see the white blur. After all this, I don't know what the Plunkus is. A beast? A spirit? A demon? All of them? All I know is that Earl never got his tooth fixed. The pain just went away. Chuck has never had a night terror since, and I know that it's still there, and I remember how old and mysterious my state still is. Hell, Stephen King loves it for a reason, right? This happened to me in September of last year. I was driving to my hometown from my current residence, which is about 180 miles away. I had gotten a late start, so the sun was setting when I left, and it was fully dark when I exited the interstate. I turned onto the highway that connected my hometown to the interstate. My hometown is a fairly small city, and the highway runs through a very rural part of my rural state. In the daytime, there's usually a few cars driving around, because there's access to some nice boating areas off the highway. But at that time of night, and this time of year, the highway was basically deserted. Anyway, I noticed someone with a large pack sticking out their thumb. Being September, it was cold enough to make me feel sympathetic for someone stuck walking outside. I'd stopped for hitchhikers a few times before, and never had any real problems. Even been able to help some people who were clearly in a very bad spot in their lives. I remember feeling relieved when I stopped the car and got out, because I saw that the hitchhiker was an older lady. I'm a big guy, but I'm still nervous about being overpowered in situations like that, and I figured that this lady would be a pretty safe ride to give. She looked like she was in her late 40s or early 50s, kind of a rounded face that was weathered and dirty, but not visibly messed up by drug use or anything like that. I helped her put her bag in the back of the car, and she thanked me profusely. The first thing I noticed is that her breath stank of alcohol. It didn't smell like beer, but some kind of liquor, strong enough to make me feel a little woozy when she was talking to me. It didn't really bother me that much though. She seemed fairly lucid, and I didn't think it was my place to judge a transient person for wanting to drink. I probably would in that situation too, but I remember it. I started driving down the road, and we were talking. She seemed pretty pleasant. The fact that she wanted to make conversation eased my mind even more. She mentioned that she had been married before, but had separated from her husband several years ago. She spoke about traveling from the eastern US to the western states several times, and didn't seem too troubled by not having a permanent residence. At that point, I was happy to take her as far as I could, which was about another hour of drive time. Then she started talking about strange things. The first thing she mentioned was that she had left her husband to follow God. This didn't faze me much, because this was in the Bible Belt, and saying that you follow God, or some such, isn't too unusual. But, as she kept talking about it, I realized that she had left her husband to follow the voice of God. Again, mental illness isn't very unusual in this kind of population, and is not something to stigmatize, so I tried not to let it bother me. But again, I was driving with this stranger on a deserted highway on a pitch-black night, and she was starting to talk about God speaking directly to her. She started talking about her travels out west, which was where things got really strange. She described meeting an Arab man with olive skin on the side of a road. He wore a turban, had a beard, and held the leash of a white tiger. They looked at each other. Neither said anything, so she pretended to be a rock and crouched down on the ground until he passed her. I was trying to politely make conversation, so I laughed and asked her, "Really?" in a prompting sort of way. She nodded and began to pick up steam. Her voice raised, and she started talking about hearing gunshots on the plains the day after her encounter with the man and his tiger. She looked up and saw 7 wild horses race in front of her. By this time, I was getting a little nervous. Then she looked at me and said, "Last week, I saw a T-Rex." A T-Rex? I'm pretty sure I wasn't completely hiding the incredulity from my voice. "Yes," she said. "Mother and child." She said that she had seen a gang of men seize the child from the mother and drive metal tie-down stakes into its hands and feet. This is because its eyes weren't open yet, and I presume it would be easier to control that way. They were then pulling ropes through the tie-downs to hold it in place. I'm not sure whether it was the nightmarish scene she was describing, or her obviously debilitated mental state, but I decided right then to find a way to part with this woman. I spotted an intersection that led to a smaller east-west highway rather than the southbound one we were on right then, and I told her truthfully that she could come get to where she wanted to go more easily by taking that highway instead of the one we were on, but that I couldn't go that way. I suggested dropping her off at a nearby gas station, and she agreed, much to my relief. I stopped and felt reassured by the lights of the gas station and the presence of a clerk inside. She got out of my car and removed her pack from it. She returned to the passenger side window and looked inside, thanking me for the ride. I responded appropriately, and then she said the strangest thing of all to me. "You remind me of my ex-husband, so I want to give you a piece of advice. Go around Missouri, not through it." She left, and I drove away. I'm determined to not do two things: ever meet this woman again, or go through Missouri. When we were younger, about 13 or so, me and 3 friends were just goofing off after school as usual, riding our bikes and just doing what young teens do. We eventually rode past the old abandoned house that's local for us, which has basically been there since we can remember. My friend's parents, who were here since the 70s, can remember that house being abandoned since there also. Anyhow, we rode past it as usual, and decided to go a bit closer because we always were curious. As we approached it, we saw someone peeking through the curtains. As curious teenagers, we naturally go to inspect. As we got closer, the curtains kind of drew back and the figure disappeared. Stumped, we decided to approach the veranda, and that's when we heard a baby crying. The crying slowly progressed into wailing, and eventually one friend had enough and knocked to see if anyone was home. After 5 minutes of continued knocking and wailing, the door finally opened. It was a little lady who looked to be about 40 or so. My friend asked if everything was okay, and if the baby was fine, and the lady simply told us to go away. My friend continued to ask if she needed help, or if everything was alright, and she continued with her reply of, "Go away." This continued for about a minute, until she shut the door on us, and the wailing became louder still. At this point, everyone wanted to run, but my friend decided to knock again in fear the child was being neglected. Eventually, after a few knocks, the door just kind of opened. Not scary creaking open, but rather it was left unlocked. We, as dumb teenagers, walked in to see if everything was okay, and partially due to curiosity. As all 4 of us walked in, the crying stopped, and we stood in this abandoned house covered in dust, and everything was like it hadn't been inhabited in decades. We took a few steps forward and the crying began again. By this point, we decided we needed to find the child, so me and a friend went upstairs while the other 2 investigated downstairs. As we climbed the stairs, the crying got louder and louder, and we continued to search each room slowly. Eventually, we reached the last room, and it was apparently where the cot was, so we opened the door to investigate. The first thing we both noticed was nothing except for a baby carriage in the far left corner near the window. The crying was coming from there. It was as clear as day. We made our way to it, peeked over to find nothing. But the crying was still there. From this empty carriage. My head started spinning. I don't know what to feel. I called out for my friends downstairs, and they ran upstairs and saw, or rather, didn't see, what we couldn't see. They filled us in onto what they saw downstairs, which was the woman walking into the kitchen downstairs. They followed her, and she vanished. We all knew this whole situation was messy, and we ran as quickly as we could to the front door. We got onto our bikes, looked back, to see the door being closed slowly by someone and then locked. A few moments later, the curtains were pulled back by a woman holding a child, smiling. We rode hard and fast back home and didn't turn back, and didn't sleep much for a few days. A few years after, the house got demolished, but people began seeing a woman holding a baby at the local parks and bridge. That is, when you didn't see the kid who drowned in the sewers nearby. I hated that area, and I was so glad when I moved. Sometimes I drive past it at night, and I just get the worst feeling ever. It's always too quiet, and still scares me 11 years later. Close to my hometown, there was an old abandoned mental hospital. They had since built a new one by a regular hospital, but this old one still remained and was in rough shape, which made it extra creepy. Quite often, kids would go there to root around and whatever, because it was a weird and creepy place and something to do. A few of my friends and I decided we would go one evening to see how creepy it actually was. This was during the middle of summer, so it was 80+ degrees, and it had been for the past 2 or 3 months. And this night was well into the 70s. We spent about 90 or so minutes on the upper floors, and eventually we got to a point where the floor had caved in and opened to the basement, and one of the guys climbed his way down to check things out. He found a door that, to ground level, all the other basement access points were totally locked up / closed off. He prepped the lock from the other side and went down there, only to find this area seemingly completely untouched by vandalism and the decay of the upper floors. It was crazy how good of a shape things down here were. There was a bowling alley with pins still standing, and all kinds of other cool things, but that was the weird part. Eventually, we found this tunnel next to a larger room. The door was locked up, and we ventured down the tunnel to find a 14 by 14 meter room with one chair with straps in the middle, like an old electric chair. Some crazy machines, I assume, that ran shock therapy, and ice covering the entire room. This was the weird thing. Nowhere else in the whole building was colder than 70, and probably had not been below freezing for 5 months. But this room was covered and obviously really cold because of that. Ice on the walls, floor and ceiling, and was just totally covered in 2 to 3 inches of ice, and no pooling of water like it was melting. It was just super weird. Still no clue how or why the room was like that. There hasn't been an HVAC system running in that place for years. No sign the room had been entered into for at least 40, and overall, it was just downright strange. This took place when I was 12. I live in a suburban neighborhood. Our house is beside railway tracks. Because of this, teenagers will walk along the tracks at night and climb over the railings into our backyard. Most of the time they're only playing around or exploring, so there isn't much trouble with them. But sometimes more malicious people will come off the tracks. I was home alone when this took place. It was around 1:20, and it was very dark outside. I was watching TV in my room, and I heard my house phone ring, but I let it go to voicemail because I wasn't bothered to answer it. 2 minutes later, the phone rang again. This time I went to answer it in case it was urgent, despite the fact it was 1 a.m. When I picked up the phone, I said hello, and received no reply. I said hello again, but got no answer. So I hung up. It was probably a butt dial. When I went back, I settled into my room watching TV, and I heard a rattling sound from outside. I heard it again, so I looked out my window thinking it was probably just teenagers trying to jump over the chain link fence. Except there wasn't a group of teenagers. It was just a guy trying to get over the fence. He had a torch in his mouth, and I knew this was shady, but I didn't know what to do. I didn't call the police. I just watched him. I don't know what I was thinking. The man finally got over the fence. I couldn't see his face, but he was pointing his flashlight at various things in my yard. Everything valuable, such as bikes, were kept away in a locked shed, so I knew he would just get bored and walk away. But he didn't. He hung around in the garden for a few minutes and then went towards my kitchen door. From my bedroom, I could hear the handle on the back door being messed around with. My heart sunk as I remembered that I'd left my phone in the kitchen when I was getting food earlier that night, and the only other phone was the house phone that was downstairs in the hallway, so I couldn't call the police. I then heard him bang his fist on the door, but after a minute, he stopped. I looked out of my bedroom window and watched him jump back over the fence and switch off his flashlight. I watched my yard for a few minutes to make sure he was gone. Since then, I make sure I have my phone with me everywhere I go. I hate to think what would have happened had he got in. I've got a good through hiking crew. We've done pieces of the Appalachian Trail, some Florida swamp, and a good amount in Maine. We consider ourselves pretty experienced. 2 of us are military. The other 2 are just fun to have around. So with that said, we emphasize preparation. This was probably 2015. We planned a 10-day trip in West Virginia along a river the weeks after Christmas. This is our favorite time to camp, because 1, we're all home, 2, bugs aren't around, and 3, no one else is stupid enough to camp at that time of year. We've done the trail before and felt comfortable with the forecast. Highs in the low 30s, lows in the teens, nothing we couldn't handle. We set off. Weather is great. The trail we're on is a 26-mile loop, hand-railing a river most of the way. We eventually get to the spot we mapped out on the second day, about 14 miles in, and get ready to chill and do man stuff for the week. We rock out of the woods doing the usual for us, cutting wood, hopping into the river, hunting, fishing, writing and the like. Now we've been out there before, and have explored perhaps a 3x3 square grid radius, and we didn't hear or sense the presence of anyone else near there. Things start to get gnarly. I'll get into the paranormal first though. It's 5 a.m, and we start getting into our morning routine. One of the guys heads the 10 meters down the river to catch breakfast. One starts checking on the NOAA forecast on the radio, and one starts to unfreeze our water filter. And I'm pulling out the morning firewood. I'm restarting our fire as it gets brighter. I notice there's this gorgeous pair of black labs rummaging around the outskirts of our camp. Pleasantly surprised, we are all pumped to find some pups, because we're idiots and none of us care where they came from. Within seconds, this raggedy-looking West Virginia guy appears out of nowhere by a tree, shotgun over the shoulder, sweet jean jacket on, and a cowboy hat. The good West Virginian look that I respect. He says morning and that we have a nice fire. The way he said it was chilling. We all felt like we could see right through him. We asked him how he got there. Mind you, the sun is barely peeking through the woods, and we're 14 miles in nowhere forest, and we haven't seen a trace of anyone in 5 days. The man says nothing, looks at us and turns to walk out into the dawn, with the dogs following. We're standing there dumbfounded, and when we find our pulse, immediately start looking from where he came from and which direction he was heading. Obviously we found nothing. No tracks, not even the dogs. But now to the survival part. We had snow in the forecast for most of the week, which we had almost every day. Not too much, maybe only 4 inches through the week, but we noticed it had started to get warmer. We're laying down for the night, checking our nightly forecast, and they're talking about the snow coming in for the night. No worries in our mind, at least it's not rain. False. We had limited cloud cover the day before, and the air was still pretty warm that night. The snow turned into rain. We hadn't taken rain precautions before we bedded down, since we were just expecting snow. We wake up around 3 a.m., packs and boots dripping. We get up to start getting an emergency plan together. The temperature is dropping, and we're wet. Precip turns to ice, with a whole day of precip ahead of us. We end up packing everything up, try to sanitize our area, but one of the guys starts going down. He's really lean, so he's pretty susceptible to cold weather injuries. We get all our dry clothing off us and get him into them. We propped up a makeshift shelter of boughs and tarps and an emergency blanket for him while we finished getting ready to step off. We rucked the 14 miles back to our car that morning and drove the 4 hours back. Lesson learned, it always rains. 5 years ago, I was a little Mormon missionary serving in Nebraska. My companion and I were at church one Sunday, and it was a typical Sunday. Said hi to all the families we saw in the halls and foyer, and there was one 13-year-old girl in the ward named Mary. She was one who always had some sort of snack made up for each of us that week that she gave to us at church. Normally she was always so nice and polite, and always took any opportunity to greet us. She was walking towards us in the hall that morning, and I noticed that she was super pale and had this wide-eyed look and was just staring straight ahead without blinking. As we were walking by, I said, "Hey Mary, how are you today?" I got no response. She didn't even look at us. Red flags went up, because she would never do something like that. After church, I told my companion that I wanted to talk to Mary's mum to see if everything was okay. When I found her, I could tell that she was uneasy and just looked worried. I asked her, and she immediately began crying. We told her that we would stop by their house immediately after church and see if we could talk with Mary and her family. When we got to her house, I had a kind of eerie feeling. I asked my companion if he felt the same, and he agreed. Mary's mum answered the door and sat us down in the living room. We asked her if everything was all right with Mary. She was at a loss for words for a moment, and just told us that she didn't know. She said the past week Mary acted mad and disgusted towards her family. Mind you, this is one of the closest families I've ever seen. She said that Mary randomly attacked her older brother earlier in the week. Nothing too serious, she just started punching and kicking him. Her mum couldn't understand the sudden change in her attitude. We asked if we could talk to Mary to see if we could get anything out of her. From the couch we were sitting on, we could see down the hallway where the bedrooms were. As soon as I saw Mary come out of her room, and as she started walking down the hallway, I immediately had a feeling that I can't quite fully describe. It was the worst feeling I've ever felt. I can honestly say that the one word to describe it would be evil. Mary had the same wide-eyed look that she had at church. She sat down in a chair in front of us and just stared at the wall in front of her. I asked her if everything was all right. She didn't answer. I asked her if she was angry at her family and why she had attacked her brothers. She finally stopped staring at the wall and looked at me. That awful feeling I had got worse when she looked at me, and she said that she was told to hurt him. I asked her, who told her? And she said the voices told her to hurt her family and leave. I asked her if she knew where the voices were coming from, and she didn't answer. I asked her mother if I could give her a blessing. She immediately said yes. When we gave her a blessing, she didn't resist at all. She just sat there. After we gave her the blessing, the mood immediately changed. She was no longer wide-eyed, with a glazed look about her. Her color was starting to come back, and she was breathing heavily. That awful evil feeling that I had gone away. As male missionaries, we aren't allowed to hug females, but after a few minutes had gone by, Mary gave me a very big hug, and I wasn't about to fight it or deny it. When we left their house and got into our car, my companion and I just both sat there for a few minutes, thinking about what the hell had just happened. He finally broke the silence and said, "I don't like the feeling I had back there." I told him I had the same feeling. We checked up on her next Sunday at church, and she was back to being the happy-go-lucky Mary that everyone knew. We asked her mum how everything was back at home, and she said it was like nothing had happened. A few weeks later, I asked Mary if she remembered anything about it. She said that she could only vaguely remember attacking her brother and not knowing why, and that after that we gave her a blessing. It was like she'd woken up from a dream. Being a religious person, you hear stories about demons and possessions in the scriptures and in stories, and there are countless movies about them. But I never gave it a real second thought. I don't know exactly what happened with Mary, whether she was actually possessed or it be something else. She didn't crawl up a wall. Her head didn't spin around, and she didn't speak in a different language. All I have to go on is this feeling. The feeling I had when she walked into the room, with her glazed look, pale skin, and her answer about the voices. I will never forget that story, or the feeling I had. I hope to never feel it again, and it scared the hell out of me. Sorry to get all religious. I have never shared this story before. This happened when I was 10 or 11. I was living with my mum and sister in a super old rural farmhouse, probably from the early 1900s in Northern California, the town of Loomis. It was a basic 3-bedroom, 1-bathroom house with a cellar and attic, and lots of land for horses and fruit trees. So one hot summer day, when my sister, mother and I were all home, I was playing Warcraft 2 or something on my computer, and started to hear extremely loud and violent banging on the wall. It was literally rattling on the windows. Being rather absorbed in my gameplay, I let it go until a few minutes had passed, at which point my confusion meter had reached its limits, and I had to figure out what was causing it. Naturally, I assumed it was my sister, who was 16 at the time and was being stupid, kicking the walls with both legs. That's how loud it sounded. But she wasn't. In fact, she assumed I was doing the same. It confused both of us, because it was even louder than we thought a person could kick the wall. It sounded like a freaking car ran into the house over and over for several hours. We grabbed our mum, who indicated she heard the same thing. None of us were doing it. We looked on the roof and in the attic, both of which were totally clear. The pipes, the plumbing, and the electrical had never made such violent noises before, and were not causing them now. So we were totally at a loss as to what was making these horrible violent bangs. It shook the window panes and could be heard through the entire house. No way could it have been an earthquake, because the floor wasn't shaking. We just heard such loud banging. Coincidentally, this was the same day a family friend's son had died, although I don't know why that would have anything to do with it. Some other creepy stuff happened in the house, not on the same day, but throughout the 3 years that we lived there. I would feel a presence walk out of my mum's bedroom and through the living room behind me when I was there playing video games. My mum also dreamt that a brown smoke was trying to enter her abdomen. She was paralyzed and couldn't scream, but I heard her struggling through the wall. We had a weird shared closet with a door in between our rooms, and woke her up. Another time I went down to the basement to look for something. I seem to remember I was checking on the kittens, to which our cat had given birth to down there, and a strange black mist slowly covered my foot, promptly making me get the hell out of there, and I never returned. I'm guessing that this all had to do with the fact that my mum practiced witchcraft and was actually in a coven for years, but I'm not sure. We never determined the source. My dad also went on to die probably less than a year after this, and we were still living there. Perhaps it was a strange premonition. I would love to hear your thoughts. I had pet rabbits as a kid. They lived outside in a cage, a really big cage inside a bigger shed, which was pretty nice for rabbits, and it had heating and everything. I got home late from something, maybe a family party. I went out with my older sister to feed them, and at the time we were about 5 and 7. On the way to the cage, we both saw what appeared to be a really tall, thin man running inhumanly fast through our backyard. We live in what is basically a swamp, and he had to have cleared this giant downed tree and run through mud and ferns, but regardless, he seemed to be going over 15, maybe even 20 miles per hour. We both dropped what we had and bolted back inside. At the time, our parents were able to convince us it was a deer or something. We wanted to believe it, so we convinced ourselves that it was. I convinced myself for over a decade of what we saw. But fast forward to a few years ago, I was at a park near my house with a friend late at night. I pulled into the dirt road drive in my Outback and parked facing the old practice field. It was far too foggy to see across the field, except for a split second, where we could see what appeared to be a very tall man running across the field. We drove as fast as that Subaru could take us, drifting out of the park. Now, a year or two ago, I was at the same park, under similar circumstances. This time it was clear but very windy. From across the field and into the field, we heard a crash and a scream. Not a crash, then a scream. They were simultaneous. It was the most shrill, terrifying, god-awful screech I'd ever heard. More human than a fisher cat, but far louder and more shrill than even a woman.
We noped out of there as fast as we could. There was also one other thing that happened. Anyway, this was when I was a sophomore in high school, around the same time of the first encounter at the practice field from the previous story. I was at my friend Nick's house, with a couple of other friends, and we were all staying the night. It was just the 4 of us high schoolers there at night. That same night, there was a severe weather warning due to a storm that had the potential to create tornadoes, which it did closer to the Connecticut River Valley and parts of Massachusetts. I think there was somewhere around 3 small tornadoes that night, pretty wild for New England/New York. The wind, even without the tornadoes, was intense, and we were just glad that this house had a good-sized yard with no tall trees to fall. It was pouring rain, there was lightning, and the classic backdrop to your spooky story. We're all set up on the second story of the top floor. One of our friends was asleep and somehow managed to sleep through this entire ordeal. The rest of us were all awake, talking about how we weren't in danger of tornadoes, except one of us was convinced that we were all going to die that night. Mid-conversation, there's a loud bang, and the entire house rattles. Is that even supposed to happen? What could it be? We come up with some theories. Is there a tree down? No trees, earthquake? No reports online? Maybe wind? No trees downed outside? We're down to the bulkhead, just slammed the door shut, and we grab a few knives and head downstairs. In the living room, we all notice for the first time how many porcelain dolls Nick's mother owns. We check every room to find nothing but those creepy dolls, but nothing that could cause a bang. There are 2 rooms left, the basement and the closet, that is barely enough to hold folded linens. We decide if the bulkhead isn't locked, then we forgot to close it, and there'll be water in the basement, and the sound we heard was the wind knocking it shut. If the bulkhead is locked, we remembered to close it. The bulkhead was locked shut, and the floor was bone dry. The sound wasn't the bulkhead. There's 1 room left, and it's the closet. What could be in the closet? It's only big enough to hold Houdini himself. We open it up, and instantly something falls and we hear the sound of glass shatter. Looking at the ground, it's one of the dolls. What was it doing in the closet? Why would it be propped up that easily to let it fall? We couldn't care. We just went upstairs and did our best to fall asleep. It's something that we all try not to think about, but every once in a while we hear a murmur or a grunt, and we'll never know what it was or where it was coming from. We also don't know whatever happened to that broken doll.
I'm going to start by saying that my dad is a character. All of my friends loved him growing up, because he could entertain you just by talking to him. This attitude is what initially led me to question the legitimacy of this story for a long time. Now that I'm a bit older, I could tell this one cuts deep every time we make him tell it. Usually, he talks in a very upbeat and active tone, but when my brothers and I first heard him tell this story, or talk about it in general, his tone completely changes. It feels as if the color just rushes from his face. It's obvious. He doesn't enjoy talking about it. He was about 18 at the time. From pictures, he seemed like an athletic, approachable teen. He was living in the Gary/Whitting area of northwest Indiana. Sometime later in the evening, my dad, who's been a smoker for roughly 50 years of his life, decides to hitchhike to his local convenience store. He has a knack for talking about places or events as if you were just there. An odd thing to do, considering the shop was only a couple of miles away from his house. Eventually, a truck pulls to the side of the road. It was a baby blue pickup truck to be exact. Apparently, there were 2 men in the truck, probably both in their late 40s or so, pretty average looking. He said the driver was a bit burly, and sort of looked like Jackie Gleason. The truck was only a 3-seater, so the man in the passenger side had to move to the middle. No words were spoken, apart from the driver asking him where he was going. This didn't strike my father as odd, so he proceeded to sit in silence, not suspecting anything. When out of nowhere, one of the guys randomly bursts into laughter. According to my father, this wasn't your ordinary laugh, but something much more diabolical. Surely enough, the driver looks at my father with what he claimed were the devil's eyes, now chiming in with the laughter. As you could expect, they start to go in a different route. My dad knew they weren't going anywhere near the desired destination. He was trying to play it cool, wait for his chance, and luckily, a couple of minutes later, they finally hit a red light. The driver slowly crept his arm across the cab and began caressing my dad's neck. I guess his fight or flight kicked in, and with a surge of adrenaline, he unlocked the door and bolts out, not looking back. He said he hid in a local church and waited as they drove around looking for him. Some years later, my dad was watching the news when the mugshot of a man popped up on screen. His heart sank. The man was undoubtedly the same one who had picked him up hitchhiking. That man was notorious serial killer John Wayne Gacy.
Let me set the scene. I live in the outskirts of a town at the end of a terraced house, and there are lots of houses in my area, in front and behind. I was home alone with 3 dogs. My boyfriend was over at his friend's, which was a 3-minute walk away. And this time, we didn't really lock the front door, if one of us was in the house, but now I do. Nothing really happened where we lived. We had 3 decently sized dogs, and were a bit naive. And to be fair, I had recently moved in here with my boyfriend, and before I lived in a small village where everyone knew everyone, and you could actually leave your door unlocked. So I was sat in my pajamas, watching TV, with all the dogs next to me when the door knocks. It was around 10 PM, and I was in my PJs, so was a bit annoyed. I got the dogs off me, and walked out of my living room and pulled the living room door closed, closing the dogs in. Bear in mind it took all of 10 seconds to do this, and as I approach, the door swings open, and this man that I have never seen storms into my house and gets right into my face. There's also another man and a woman right behind him who don't enter. I was frozen in shock. Who the hell do you think you are? You think you can just run around here doing what you want? What? Don't give me that. Do you think I'm a muppet? I saw you and all your little friends running back into this house. I'm literally standing here in my PJs and haven't been outside. Okay. Do you think I was born yesterday? Well, you just walked into someone's house that you've never met and screamed at her, so maybe it wasn't her, man. Maybe. At this point, my dog started barking behind the door. The man stares at me for what seems like forever, but was more probable just a few seconds, and then walks out and slams the door shut. I was standing there shaking for a few seconds before I started to just get mad, when I realized what had happened. I lock the door and ring my boyfriend straight away, who gets home in about 1 minute flat, but the group was nowhere to be seen. I didn't want to call the police, because I couldn't really give my boyfriend a good description when he was asking. In the 7 years since, I have not bumped into these people again. Thank God. I now always lock the door, and thankfully, as we've had 2 other occasions where people have come late at night, but those are other stories. However, if it did happen again, I would like to think I would handle myself better now. When I was in high school, I had a really good friend who lived next door to a house that was always up for sale. People would move out in the middle of the night without a word, and it hadn't had the same owner for more than 6 months straight for a couple of years. One night, we were really bored, and he suggested we go explore the house next door, since it sat empty for a while. We go around back, and there's a dog door that he can crawl through, and he unlocks the door and lets me in. The house itself is really unremarkable. It looked like it was built in maybe the 1950s and was a craftsman-style house in an older, nicer part of town. My friend's house was similarly built. The kitchen had a really nice built-in breakfast table set against a picture window. The house's electricity was off, but you could see the street light through the window. My friend and I sit down on the floor across from this table and are just hanging out, talking. Why? Who knows? All of a sudden, my friend screams, and in that instant my vision goes blank. But it wasn't that I couldn't see. My body was just engulfed in this sickly coldness from head to toe. I start screaming, and I feel my friend's hands grabbing mine and pulling me into some direction forcefully. My vision slowly returns, and I begin to warm up when I realize that we're outside under the streetlight. It was December, and should have been much warmer inside of that house. Finally, I look at my friend and he looks scared. I'm really confused and kind of panicking myself, and I finally ask him what happened. He says that as I was talking, a black thing, this figure that was all black and only had the vague shape of a girl, crawled out from under the table and sat on top of me. Apparently, I started groping around with my eyes wide open, like I couldn't see, and he was so freaked out he pulled me out of that house. We're still friends, and we bring it up every now and then, but the story itself never changes, and still sends chills down my spine. To this day, I've never felt such blackness or coldness in my life. It was palpable, almost sticky. For a couple of days after, I couldn't shake this unsettling feeling, and I could never walk past that house again. And now, I'm scared to get out of bed. I am a 32-year-old man. Yet, as I say this in broad daylight, it still haunts me, to the point that merely thinking about it, or in this case, sharing the memory, is enough to send chills down my body and make me feel like a terrified child. I have only shared this experience with a handful of people over the past 10 years, because of how terrifying of an experience it was. But I feel like it can be therapeutic to get it off my chest and share it with others. Perhaps others have had similar experiences. To tell this story and to give it justice, I have to tell you of an experience that happened 3 years before the terrifying encounter. Buckle up. This will be long. My name is Joshua, and I live in Arkansas, and in late 2003, near the middle of fall, right before it started getting really cold, my wife and I were invited to camp with a friend of mine and his girlfriend at Sugarloaf Lake in Oklahoma. I say camp. but the actual plan was to meet at Sugarloaf, and my friend, Bob, wanted to take me and my wife around to some paranormal places in the Sugarloaf area. So we got there around 7 p.m. I was driving a white Ford 1996 F-150. Bob was driving a 1980-something white Celebrity, which was a really piece of rubbish vehicle. Anywho, it was late, dusk becoming dark, and we all climbed into Bob's car, and he took us around the area, first to an old abandoned house. But other than some raccoons just rustling around, it was a waste of 2 hours. Then he took us to a graveyard that was supposedly haunted. Again, it was a bust. Then an old church that was run down. Yawn. Nothing. At this point, it was getting close to midnight, and my wife and I were pretty bored. And I spoke up to Bob, saying, "Man, this really hasn't been that freaky of a night." That's when Bob smiled, saying that he was saving the best for last. He handed me a few Polaroid pictures of a hillside covered in trees and daylight. I asked him what it was, and he asked me if I saw a house or any type of light pole or anything in the picture, to which I replied, no. He took the picture back and said that's because there isn't, and there's no power lines either. About this time, he turned down an old dirt road and passed a small house. Then after that, it was 2 miles of dirt road with woods on either side of a barbed wire fence, on the other with about 2 acres of field connecting to a wooded hillside. Nothing to light the night except the full moon above, and the clear starry sky. After what seemed like forever, he stopped the car and told us to all get out. We did as he said. He walked us to the side of the car, where the fence, field, and wooded hillside was. He looked at his cell phone, which his phone and my phone had no signal. This was 03, and this area had no cell towers, but he looked at his phone and it read 11:57. He told us all to watch the middle of the hillside. Even in the complete darkness, I could tell that it was the same field and hillside from the picture. 2 minutes go by and nothing had changed. Then at exactly midnight, a small flickering light goes off in the middle of the hillside. A chill runs down my back as my wife, Bob, and his girlfriend and myself watch this small light, which to me looked like an old kerosene lantern, begin to move, swaying back and forth. We watched in complete silence for what seemed like several minutes, when I finally spoke up and asked what the story was with this. Bob replied he didn't know, but locals had told him that at midnight every night, this lantern would light up and sway back and forth through the woods until the sun comes up and then it disappears. Nobody knew what the story was. At the time, I was a 19-year-old guy who didn't think anything would scare or hurt me. So, since there were no homes around, I yelled out, "We see you now. Not so scary with your little lantern." Bob hushed me, but it was too late. My wife screamed and pointed. I was laughing, but my laughter stopped as I looked up to the hillside to see the lantern swaying back and forth, but moving down the hillside towards the field at an inhuman pace. Gliding, it began to speed across the field towards the car. We didn't stick around to see what it was, because within a second we were in the car flying down the dirt road back to the lake. We looked back and saw the lantern slowly moving back up the hillside to where it first appeared. The ride back was silent, until Bob spoke up, saying, "Crap, I forgot to put gas in earlier, and the only store around is closed.
and if we decided to go back out anywhere, it would be best to take my truck until he could get gas in it in the morning, as he only had about half a quarter tank left. I said okay, and a few minutes later we arrived back at Sugarloaf Lake. We had parked by the lake docks, and we dropped my tailgate and sat and spoke about what had just happened. Bob's girlfriend was pregnant at the time, and told him she was hungry. He told her we had brought some snacks, but he said she needed actual food. But since the local store was closed, he asked if he could take my truck to the next town over to get some food, because his car wouldn't have enough gas to get us into town. I obliged. We shut our cooler, put the tailgate up, and loaded into my truck. I turned the key and nothing happened. My truck was dead. Deader than dead. No ding, no lights, no clicking noise. Nothing. For all intents and purposes. You would think that the alternator was out. This was strange, and after the night we had been through, it made us feel very uneasy. We got out of the truck and popped the hood. We pulled Bob's car around to the front and attempted to jump-start my truck with his car. This is where it gets even weirder. As soon as we connected the jump cables to his battery and mine, his girlfriend starts his car, and within a second of the cables in between, the connectors start to smoke, and in a flash of fire, they burn up, and within a few seconds, they were nothing more than bits of melted rubber and ash, with only the end clamps still on our batteries. Bob runs and turns off his car engine, and we take the clamps off our batteries. We look at each other in the early moon and starlit night. Did I mention there were no light poles around? And we both get a bad feeling at the exact same time, as we suddenly realize we had been hearing a distant noise in the lake that was getting louder. It was like a motorboat. Now, like I said, this was the time of year it was starting to get cold, especially at night. We were bundled up as it was, and we were standing still on land at night. But somebody was out on a boat after midnight? When it had to be chilly, as there's all that wind hitting them, and from the sound of this motor it was going pretty fast, but we saw nothing. That is until the boat was about 50 yards away, and a very bright spotlight comes on, temporarily blinding us all. Bob and I tell the women to get into his car and lock the doors. I reach into the bed of my truck and give Bob a tire tool, and I pick up another, as I work at a tire shop and had all kinds of tools of the trade in my truck. We were standing in front of the vehicles in the middle, the hoods up on both, as the boats pull up to the dock, and two heavily bearded men in their 30s to 40s step out of the boat and walk up. It's hard to give an accurate description, as their spotlight was still pointed to us, and it covered the men in an eerie shadow whilst blinding Bob and I. They look at us, at our vehicles, and one glances in the direction of the car, at the women, and then back at us, and lets out a small chuckle. "You fellas got into some sort of car trouble?" one asks as he lights up a cigarette. "Yeah, but it's nothing we can't handle," I stammer. The guy with the cigarette sniffs the air and looks down between Bob and I's feet, and sees the still smoking ashes of what used to be the jump cable. "Looks like it was more than your terrible jump cables could handle. Y'all need some help?" We got some tools on the boat. We got some tools on the boat that I think could help fix you guys' problem right up. Then the other man who had chuckled in the beginning says,
fix 'em right up. I'm speechless at this moment, and my mouth is probably hanging agape. I can't remember as the two men walked back to their boat, and we heard what sounds like chains rattling around as we try to make out what they're doing, but the spotlight was so blinding we could barely see. Anyway, the chain noise was enough, and Bob looked at me without saying a word, and we both jumped into his car and drove the hell out of there. For the next few hours we drove to a populated area of the houses, which wasn't mainly in the rural area we were pretty much stuck in, since we had very little fuel. But we all sat in the car mostly quiet, looking around in all directions in near panic, thinking that at any given moment those men would find us. It had been a very scary ordeal. Bob would turn his headlights on every now and then, thinking he had seen some movement in the dark. After a while the women fell asleep, and Bob and I spoke about how strange this all was, and he laughed, saying, "I told you it would be a scary night. I just didn't know if it would be this sort of scary." At this point the paranormal lantern wasn't even the main thing freaking me out, but the men never showed, and eventually the morning was on its way, and it was about 20 minutes until sunrise, and Bob asked if I wanted to go see if the lantern really disappears at sunrise. I asked if he was sure he had enough gas to get there, and he said yeah, the local store opens up in about an hour, so that'll be fine. I tell him in that case then yes. We wake the women up and drive back to the hillside. We get there with about 4 minutes left of sunrise, and we still see the lantern swaying in the woods. Bob looks at me and I smile, and do the motion for zipping my lips, as we all watch in wonder, as right as the sunrise hits the hills, does the lantern slowly fade away into nothing. After this, we get back in the car and drive back to the lake, feeling safer now. When we get there, there is no sign of the boat, and the hood of my truck is still up, and the doors are still locked. On a whim I tell Bob I'm going to try and start the truck one more time before he drives us somewhere, where I can get a cell signal and call for help. And I'll be damned, the truck started right up there and then without hesitation. We all went our separate ways, happy to have seen the sunrise and counting our blessings, and swearing to leave the paranormal investigating in the area to others, and swearing that we never wanted to come back to this area and run into the boat people again. However, all things fade with time, even fear and common sense. 3 years later, Bob, who I haven't seen in almost 2 years at that point, calls me up and says he has a proposition for me. He goes on to tell me he has a group of himself and 3 other Wiccans who go out and do seances in haunted places, and asked me if I'd be willing to film one of their sessions in a haunted place for their records, and that they would even pay for my services. I am no Wiccan, but I've always loved the paranormal. Even after what I went through at Sugarloaf, I still had an itch to scratch when it came to getting scared and dealing with the paranormal and the unknown, and I told him yes, I would love to go with them, but I had no interest in joining in, but was okay with watching and just getting to be out there and looking into the paranormal once again. So of course my next question was, when and where we were going to be doing this. When he answered, I got a terrible gut feeling, and I wish so much that I had trusted my gut and told him that I had changed my mind. Remember that lantern light out near Sugarloaf? As if there were any way I could forget. Yeah? Why? I told my group this story, and they want to do the ritual there and see if we can contact the spirit and find out what it is and why it's there, Bob replied. I don't know, man. Oh, come on, Josh, trust me, you'll be safe. I'm going to pay you $250 in cash, just to sit there and film it. At this time, I was about to become a father, and money was tight due to diapers, formula, and everything involved in being a parent does cost a small fortune. Not to mention it was my first kid and my new wife's first kid, so she had been going crazy spending money on not just the necessities, but also buying only top-of-the-line baby products, like toys, cribs, playpen, baby monitors, strollers, car seat, combination packs, and play/changing tables, diaper genie, designer baby clothes. So, because my wife was putting us in the poorhouse, I had to weigh out my fear of the area as less important, because it's what I needed to make the extra money. So, against my better judgment, I accepted the offer, and a week later, I was in the same seat beat-down celebrity Bob was driving 3 years earlier. This time with Bob and 2 other guys and 1 girl that were complete strangers to me. They each were dressed very gothic and had these pentagram necklaces. It was 11:50 when we got there, and the 4 of them sat in a tight circle, and I was behind them to the right, about 5 feet from the barbed fence that was in front of the field that led to the hillside, and my back was to the hillside and bushes at the fence line, and I was filming my friend's circle as they all started chanting something. As I have been sharing this entire post, I have been getting knots in my stomach knowing that I was coming to this part of the story. This part of the story still haunts my dreams, and even waking hours to this day. I'm going to do my best to describe how the following unfolded. I know that mere words cannot do justice to the pure terror that ensued, or how horribly horrific the events surrounding were. So, when listening to this, turn your imagination all the way up, and believe me when I say this is a turning point in my life, and I was interested in the paranormal. It was a fun hobby to go out ghost hunting or get myself spooked or whatever, but after this night, I will never look at the paranormal as fun or interesting anymore, or whatever. But after this night, I never looked at the paranormal as fun or interesting anymore. I just show respect and stay as far away from it as possible, as there is so much dread just trying to share this. As his group are chanting, Bob lights up this huge candle in the middle of them and opens up some sort of book. It's not like a scary antique spell book or anything like that. He starts reciting words from it, and then he looks at his phone and tells the group to be quiet and to look at him. I turn the camera, and at midnight on the dot, the lantern appears. One member of Bob's group blurts out, "Cool." I roll my eyes, since the way these people were dressed and the way they carried themselves, the word didn't seem to fit into their vocabulary. Then Bob says to his group to join hands as they attempt to communicate with the spirit. I turn my back to the light and begin to film the group as they began again chanting, and Bob reads from the book. They then start asking questions in hopes the spirit will respond. About this time, a wind picks up, and Bob's candles go out. He tells everyone to hold on and tells me to cut the camera for a minute, and I oblige and stop recording as I watch Bob as he tries with his lighter. Then 2 lighters from his group, but none of them are working. I'm sitting down watching the group when I start hearing rustling behind me. I jump up, leaving the camera on the ground and spin around. Bob and his group are preoccupied with their candle and lighter problem, and as I spin around I'm blinded by the brightest light I've ever seen. What I believe was the lantern close up and personal, but as quick as it had appeared the light was gone, and the lantern was nowhere to be seen. If it had been the lantern that blinded me, it had moved from the hillside across the field and right behind me without me realizing it in the span of 30 seconds. I looked around for the lantern on the hillside and nothing. It was midnight, and the lights have always stayed on the hillside. At this moment, the wind quits blowing, and I hear Bob's lighter finally flick, and see it light up, and I mutter, guys, did you see that?" They all turn and ask what I'm talking about, but before I can answer them, we all stopped dead in our tracks by a distant laughter coming from somewhere, everywhere, and nowhere. It was all around us nearly. And this is no ordinary laughter. This laughter sounds like the laughter of hundreds, even thousands of children to haunt me at this very moment. As I'm recounting this, I recall looking around the room I'm in. Whenever I think or talk about this experience, I can vividly remember that terrifying sound and hear it in my head. Also, it just occurred to me that when you put the letter S at the beginning of the letter, it spells slaughter. Why did I think of that? The best way I can describe this laughter is for you to imagine a large group of kids singing "Row, row, row your boat." You know how one kid will start and seconds later another will join? And then hundreds of thousands of children laughing. As if one would start laughing and seconds later another would, and the pattern went on in an endless loop. I'm not saying the laughter sounded like the song "Row, row, row your boat." I'm saying they sounded in unison, like when the kids sing "Row, row, row your boat" together. One would start, then another later would start, and then another later, and the laughter was getting louder and closer. There was sinister laughing, goofy laughing, giggling, and all kinds of laughter coming from all around us. This couldn't be real. This sort of thing does not happen. What the hell was happening? I scream at Bob and his group that we need to get the hell out of there, but they were already running for the car, leaving their Wiccan book and candles behind, and without hesitation, I run after them and jump into the car just as the laughter is becoming deafening. We haul us out of there and drive about a mile up the road and pull over, as Bob is in no condition to drive and we're all freaking out. We all get out of the car, pacing around it, asking each other if we had just really heard what we did. I tell Bob, and that I'm so sorry because I had left the camera behind. He says he doesn't care and that he isn't going back for it. At this point I've got my hands on my knees, panting to try and catch my breath, as I have never in my life before been so terrified. That is when all of our chatter stops, as we once again heard the laughter off in the distance, very quietly at first, but slowly getting closer and closer and louder, until once again it's becoming deafening, and we jump back in the car and speed away. We drive about 6 miles, and for the first 3 we can still hear the laughter in the distance, with our windows down a little. We all begin to calm down by mile 4, when the laughter can no longer be heard, but we have no intention of pulling over, and Bob's friend is in the passenger seat with his phone, waiting for a signal to pop up. As he's about on mile 6, Bob's friend says he got 4 bars, and he hands the phone to Bob as he calls a friend of his who is into the occult and well versed an educator in it. And as we are driving, he describes what happened to the lady. Bob told me his friend told him that she believed in the children of the Hector or something like that. I have no idea about what the Hector is, but something like more of a guess to me. Anyway, as Bob is on the phone speeding out of the area, me and the other 2 people in the back seat all get a chill at the same time, and they told me later that it was just like me on the hair of the back of my neck standing on end, and a loud snapping noise coming from the front end of the car, and Bobby's celebrity stops dead in its tracks and will no longer move forward. He tries everything, but the car is not moving. We later discovered that the tie rod had snapped. Anyway, the friend Bob was talking about on the phone
only lived about 20 minutes away from where we were and said that they were on their way. As we sat in the car, nobody spoke after about 3 minutes, until we saw a pair of headlights coming down the road towards us. We knew it was too soon to be Bob's friend, but me and Bob thought maybe we could get a ride from a local, and we all unloaded out the car and stood in front of it, waiting for the vehicle to come fully to a stop. Now I cannot be certain, but my gut tells me that I am correct, but the vehicle doesn't stop. But as it comes into view, it's a beat-up old pickup truck, and it slows down as in the truck there are two men in their 30s to 40s, with huge beards, and they stare down at us and speed up after passing by. I look at Bob before we can speak, and he was already thinking, the guys from the boat. Before I can say anything back, and see headlights coming from the direction the truck just went. Bob called his friend back and told her to drive like hell and get there now, then hung up. 4 to 5 minutes go by and we see headlights coming. Relieved, we get all our stuff ready thinking it was Bob's friend. Then his phone rings. It was the lady who was coming to get us, telling Bob she took a wrong turn and would be at least another 10 to 15 minutes before she arrives. Bob hangs up the phone and watches in terror, as do I, because the same truck slowly passes again, this time with only one of the boatmen in the truck. This time though, the driver starts to crawl by and says, "Looks like you fellas could use some help," and then speeds up and drives off. This cemented the fact that Bob and I were definitely dealing with the boat guys. But where the hell was the other one? Why wasn't he in the passenger seat? And to make matters worse at this point, something we had almost completely forgotten about due to the boatmen was immediately reminded to us when we began to hear the laughter again in the distance, all around us like before. Over the next few minutes, it started to get closer and closer. I'm almost urinating in my pants at the sound as it's getting deafening and we have nowhere to run this time. And then from behind our car off in the distance, we see 2 sets of headlights coming on and 2 vehicles coming towards us slowly side by side, taking up the entire width of the backcountry dirt road coming our way. The laughter now seems to be coming from the woods on both sides of the road, and we're stuck. And now the laughter is zeroing in on us as if hundreds and thousands of children are within reaching distance of us. There's no wind, no sounds other than the crunch of the tires on the rocky dirt road and the 2 vehicles that are slowly approaching us. With our last shred of hope fading away into the laughter of the children and the headlights of the 2 vehicles surely being driven by the boatmen, we are given a reprieve, as at the time, coming from the other direction, we see another set of headlights coming fast as we hold our breath. The laughter, the boatmen, what could be next? How will we get out of this? And that is when the vehicle that was coming fast pulls up, and it's Bob's friend. She unlocks the car and rolls down her window and begins to tell us to get in. When this happens, the 2 sets of headlights coming from the other direction turn off, and Bob's friend says, "Oh my God, you weren't kidding about the laughing kid," she screams. We begin to tell her about the boat guys, and she turns the car around, and no sooner had she started to drive away did the 2 sets of headlights come on again, this time with their brights on, and they go about a car's length behind the car we're all crammed in. We yell to go, channeling my inner Jeff Goldblum, telling her much faster as she floors it for about a mile or 2. But the vehicles stay on our tracks. For about the next 2 miles after that, we can all hear the laughter way off in the distance with our windows down. But after about 3 minutes, did it subside. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened, what the laughing children were, why they followed us, and if the boatmen were connected to this somehow, or if they were merely a coincidence of that day that were also there to terrify us. And why they did not react to the laughing children sound. Is the lantern connected to the laughing children, or did Bob and his group mistakenly call forth the laughing children through their ritual? Like I said,
This happened years ago, but I still feel just as terrified now when I tell people about it or think about it. I've had constant chills and goosebumps as I've tried to share this. So, I'm a bit shaky. To all of you who think the paranormal is just a fun hobby to get your thrills with, I beg of you and warn you that we are not prepared for what is really out there. You think nothing will scare you or harm you, but you are dealing with unknown things. You have no idea how mundane or powerful the paranormal could be. If you use the paranormal as a thrill-seeking hobby, just use caution and always have your vehicle checked out beforehand. Oh, and watch out for seemingly psychopathic hillbillies and laughing children. I hope we never meet again. A bit of context. I live in a one-story house with a bayou behind it. We have railings on our windows/doors because we've been broken into in the past. I've never really been afraid to stay home alone until recently. I always felt something unworldly in our home. A long time ago, we had this scary incident. My younger sister and I shared a bedroom when we were kids. Our family was religious, so we had a cross in the wall between the two of our beds. We went to a party one day with our entire family and stayed there for a few hours. I want to make it clear that everybody went to the party. My mom, dad, older sister, younger brother and I all went. We came back home and I saw that the cross that was hanging between our beds was missing. I checked under the bed and there it was under my sister's bed. To this day I have no explanation for it. My parents were also shocked, but didn't think much, so we put it back on the wall and nothing had happened to it since. That was my first real encounter with something strange. There were times where I'd lay in my bed playing with my DS, when the TV would all of a sudden turn on by itself. I had to stand up to turn it off, but it would continually turn itself on 2 or 3 times later. I wasn't sitting on a remote or anything. Everything just remained normal for a few years, but then things began picking up again. There was a time when my sister had her door knocked on and blamed me for doing it. I told her that I never touched her door, and things felt uneasy again. On another occasion, my door opened entirely by itself one day. All of the windows were closed and only the AC was on. The door was slightly cracked, but I don't believe the AC would just open the door the entire way slowly by itself. This was a recent incident, perhaps a year ago, but it scared the life out of me. I was just alone in bed, browsing on Twitter when I heard this noise. I can promise anyone that it wasn't the Candy Crush game music, because I heard the crushing of candy leaves and the distinct yum from the game. The music was also really familiar, since I played it a lot in middle school. It sounded very clear and I knew it was real. It sounded as if someone was actively playing it. I was home alone, and it freaked me out. My dad was at work, my younger brother was at school, and my sister was walking home with a friend. Once I stood up to investigate the music, it stopped. The music skipped. My heart sank. Goosebumps flooded my arms, and I bolted to my front door and stayed outside until my sister came home. I wish I had recorded the audio, because it would have made her believe me. This incident scared me incredibly. Now I'm sharing this as other things keep happening. I'm home alone, and I keep hearing this toy go off. It sounds like an elephant toy with a honking sound, and it's going off during random intervals. When I go to see what it is, nothing's there. I'm completely paranoid and freaking out at the moment. Let me start off by saying that this is not my story, but it was such a crazy encounter that I have since asked each of my friends throughout the years to recount the events. This happened around the year 2000. About a year after this took place, I started dating one of these friends, and that's when I first heard about this dog/wolf story. I have since asked each friend over the years, and miles apart, and they all remember the encounter the very same way. Before my ex was even my boyfriend, he and our other friends were all about 17 to 18 years old. At that age, I remember it being an adventure to find a place to smoke. Let's hike to this place and puff. Ah, the good old days. The four of them decided to drive to Mount Pisgah, a beautiful wooded area outside of Eugene, Oregon. It's more of a hill, but it's nature in its prime form for sure. I've been out there many times growing up, and I know exactly what trail they were on. It was Jay, my ex-boyfriend, and his best friend, Barry, and their girlfriends, Sarah and Mary. They had driven in Barry's little white sedan, parked in the parking lot, and hiked the trail to the river where they smoked some bowls. The group spent the day out there swimming, puffing and swimming, just being typical teenagers. I can imagine the hunger is what drove them to go home after a few hours, as the sun began to set. Either activity alone is bound to get someone hungry, let alone both. So they walked along the well-worn Maine dirt path to the parking lot. This has since been paved, and it doesn't take not 20 minutes for them to get back to the little footbridge by the parking lot that they had crossed when they hiked in. When they reached this small footbridge near the parking lot, Barry looked out into the vast fields between them and the wooded area, and noticed a huge dog. The dog was just sitting there, not looking scary, just looking like a humongous friendly dog, about 70 yards away. It was starting to get dark, but from Mary's description and the drawing she did later for me in 2005, it was very shaggy and furry. My friends continued to walk across this small wooden bridge, and one of the girls screamed. The big dog was now on its hind legs, standing much closer than when they had seen it a few seconds earlier. It had traversed most of the large field in the seconds it took them to get past the 10-foot-long bridge. Whatever this thing was, it was fast, quiet, and stealthy. My four friends ran to the car, and they had the classic cliché, "I can't get the key in," because Barry was fumbling madly for the keys. At this point, the dog was just standing at the very edge of the parking lot, looking at them. As my ex Jay had said, every time they looked up, he would be closer, but not moving. All of them recounted how surreal it was to see a dog standing on its hind legs. I don't know if it ran for a few ticks and then stood up again at intervals in the field, but that's the way they describe it. Many times I asked them, "Are you sure it wasn't a bear?" Nope, it was definitely a dog standing on its hind legs, a big dog that was stalking them. This is in the Lane County, Oregon in the year 2000. There are few, if any, bears out there. It would be odd, but then again I wasn't there. The kids got in the car, sped off, leaving the pig's-head dog to do its own business. I've never had any reason to doubt any of their stories. In fact, Sarah doesn't like to talk about the incident because it's just too creepy for her to recall.
To give a little bit of background, I was a 20-year-old female when this happened. The setting, a motorway in the southwest/West Midlands of England, the year 1990. So I was what was known at the time as a crusty, though I read that they're called gutter punks in the US. I had dreadlocks, listened to anarcho-punk, and dressed in rags. I was a softie from the countryside by birth, but a couple of years into the violent Nottingham squatter scene had hardened me up no end.
I had left the squatters and joined the New Age travelers, and we were an aggressive bunch of heavy drinking thieves, as you'd be likely to meet anywhere in the UK at the time. For this reason, I was fearless, but youth and a safe upbringing made me stupid when I thought I was streetwise. As was my habit, I'd taken off on my own and gone back to my hometown. Now I was hitchhiking the breadth of the country to get back to the site where my friends were. I remember waiting for my next lift at a service station when this battered old three-wheeled van pulled up. It was filthy and didn't look very pleasant, but it was going in my direction, so I was pleased. The driver seemed okay. A bit serious and intense, I suppose, but he said he could take me to the other side of Birmingham, which was very convenient for me. He was distinctive looking. This was the start of the 90s, and he looked like my dad did during the 70s, and my dad was old-fashioned his whole life. This man had thick black hair and a bit of a quiff and sideburns. He was also V-tanned, like he worked outdoors a lot. He was lean with dark eyebrows, and I remember him so well because he looked like my dad, and my uncle also. Maybe this is why I didn't feel less at ease with him. So we start along the motorway, and it all seemed fine. I was probably chatting like an idiot as usual, and I remember glancing at the back of the van and seeing a heap of junk in there, bulky and dirty, and some of it covered in a black cloth. He saw me looking at it and said it was equipment for a puppet show, which I found bizarre and incongruous. He didn't look like a children's entertainer. He was more of a child catcher than a friendly clown. Along the road a bit, he started asking me how often I hitch, and I let him know it's routine for me. He says, "But you don't get scared?" "No, not really." But this guy wouldn't leave it. "You must get scared." "No, I really don't." "Why don't you get scared?" "I can handle myself." And so he goes on and on and on. He insists I must be scared and asks me if I'm scared now and how I know I would be able to handle being attacked, and I'm getting really irritated. A bit freaked out as well, because it seems like he wants me to be scared and I'm giving the wrong answer, but mostly annoyed because this conversation is going in circles. Eventually, when he asks why, I reply, "I don't get scared because I carry a knife." This was true, but only a little lock knife for day-to-day purposes. Well, that stopped the line of questions. In fact, it stopped the whole lift. The guy swerved onto the hard shoulder at the side of the road and said, "I'll have to drop you off here." Oh. I was surprised a bit, and pissed off to be left here, but I got out and grumbled to myself as he drove away. Cars aren't allowed to stop on the hard shoulder, and people certainly aren't allowed to walk along it. But what could I do? I stuck my thumb out and started to walk. About 15 minutes later, a police car pulled up and told me off for being there, but kindly gave me a lift across to the far side of Birmingham to a safe and legal hitchhiking spot, where I was picked up by a minibus full of pagan students who took me right to their community/traveler site. Years went by. I left the sites and the squatters, had a baby, got a job, and the only time I thought about this guy was while exchanging hitchhiking stories with people. This was my second favorite story, behind the one about the Christian who drove at around 100 miles an hour on the wrong side of the road because, and I quote, "God will save me." While I screamed back, "I'm an atheist, he won't save me." After I would tell that story, I'd mention the mad puppeteer and his annoying questions. It wasn't until a couple of years ago that I realized the possible danger I had been in. I was watching a show called Crime Watch on the BBC, where they appeal for information, and they had a special on the serial killer, Peter Tobin, trying to track his movements through the years. I follow serial killer stories with interest, so I'd heard of him and had seen his picture as an old man. Then they showed the picture of him through the years, and holy shit. There he was, the mad puppeteer. The picture matched. The time matched. Just how he looked in the late 80s/early 90s. Just how he looked when he ended the life of hitchhiker Dina McKinnon in 1991. I work for the criminal justice system, so I have level-headed colleagues mostly, and told people at work. They agreed I should call the Crime Watch number. It was nothing I could do. No harm. If it was nothing I could do, then no harm. But if it was something, then I could help. I rang the Crime Watch number and said, "It's probably nothing, but..." And a few days later, they rang back and arranged to take a statement. A police officer came by to my house and wrote down everything. A few days later, a second officer came back to my workplace to get more info and to photocopy a diary I kept back then. Frustratingly, I said nothing about this lift in the diary. That's how little I thought I was in danger. The Crime Watch website updated to mention the 3-wheeled van, and now is reported in some biographies as fact. People ask me now if I truly believe that was Peter Tobin who gave me the lift. I can never be sure, but in my mind I'm 75% sure I survived a serial killer. At the very least, I now realize how stupid and naive I was feeling, so tough and so fearless. Sometimes when I think of what could have happened, I just feel sick and cold. Because of my job, I realize how many terrible, terrible people there are out there, and I'm just relieved it wasn't my parents searching for answers about one of his victims. I live in the suburban part of a small rural town in eastern Missouri, in a pretty quiet neighborhood. We've had one crime here in the past 3 years, and it was me who committed it. I'm a jaywalker, comprised mostly of elderly women and single mothers. We own 4 vehicles. My car, my mum's van, my stepdad's car, and my mum's old truck that's illegal to drive. I was home alone about a week after graduation, while my stepdad was at work. My mum was taking my youngest brother to the doctor's office, and my 2 middle brothers were at their friend's house, so I was lounging on the couch in my fuzzy robe and underwear playing Fallout. My stepdad is a professional chef, and he does 80% of the cooking at home. I have terrible anxiety, and an addiction to investigation discovery, so whenever I come home alone, I keep his longest, sharpest knife either on my person or within arm's reach at all times. It may have saved my life or something. A knock on the door isn't too suspicious. We frequently get solicitors and Mormons in the neighborhood, so I wasn't too worried. Being a cautious person, I peeked out through the curtains just a bit to see who it was. I'd seen the guy around the neighborhood before, walking, and I didn't feel threatened by him, since if it got physical, I at least had 5 inches on him, and a knife. I went to open the door, figuring that at worst I could politely turn him away, tell him I wasn't interested and go on with my life. At best, well, he was cute in a generic way. So I opened the door, resting my hand on the back of the couch, where I've hidden the knife under a blanket, just in case. As soon as I open the door, I know something's off. I've got a blunted effect due to a combination of depression, PTSD from abuse, and a schizotypical personality disorder. So I've grown used to faking facial expressions to fit in. I thought maybe this dude had similar issues, because his face was not normal. He had a big friendly smile, right below a pair of absolutely dead eyes. "Hey, beautiful day out. Mind if I come in for a moment?" I kinda smiled back at him. No, Mum doesn't like me letting strangers in." "Oh." His smile got bigger. "Okay. How are you doing?" At this point I was starting to feel nervous. I shrugged. Can't complain, I guess. Are you here to sell me something or tell me about God? He shrugged back. Oh, you know. Can I come in? Maybe talk to your mum? I'll go get her. She's in the backyard. I moved to close the door and step back, not turning my back to the dude. Before I closed the door, he reached out and stopped the door. His fake smile was gone. His face was dead. You're home alone. Your mum isn't in the backyard. I paused and swallowed hard. Then I pushed the door open again. What do you want, man? To come inside. Please let me in. I reached over, quickly slid the knife out from under the blanket, and pointed it at him. I'm not letting you in. Please, just leave. He looked at the knife, back up at me, and blinked rapidly. Then he affixed the smile to his face. Oh, no problem. Bye. I watched him turn around and walk back down the street, until he turned the corner. Then I locked and bolted every door and window in the house, got the dog out of my mum's bedroom, and resumed my gaming. I then called my aunt's boyfriend, the only cop I trust, let him know what happened, and stayed on the phone with him until my mum got home from the doctor's office. She called around town, and found out a couple of other people had seen him walking and driving around, but no one knew who he was, and we were all on high alert for about a week. It's been about a month now, and no one in town has seen him since. He's just disappeared. Hiking along a section of the Pacific Coast Trail with my aunt and dog, after 3 days, we found ourselves at an impassable river crossing with the dog and had to head back. Reluctant to go over the mountain passes we just did, we pulled out our map and find what seems to be an interesting trail through the Ansel Adams wilderness that will put us back to where we started. We go to a resupply point, get some dinner and a shower, and ask if we can get a 4-wheeler ride up the road to the trailhead. They say nobody goes up that road, and we couldn't get one, but a man on vacation with his family offers to help us out. We drive about 2 miles up this road, and it proves to be so washed out, it becomes impossible to drive further. So we thank him for his help and continue on foot. We walk another 3 miles or so to the trailhead and find it completely destroyed by fallen over trees, and it looks like no one has been there for decades. Turns out, this was an old logging road that was used in the area before it became a wilderness area 50 to 60 years ago. So we start hiking down the trail another 4 miles until we camp for the night. Along this trail, we see nothing but bear tracks and deer tracks. No people tracks, horses or anything. We even stumble on a bear in the middle of taking a dump on the side of a trail and scare him off. From our camp, the road/trail gets really tough, as it was about 6 miles of climbing over giant fir trees one after another. We finally reached an opening and followed it for about another mile until, amazingly, we couldn't believe it, but we came upon a 2-story building way out in the middle of nowhere, 15 miles from the nearest people and 50 from any civilization. This place was super eerie. The house was straight out of the Blair Witch, and it must have been there since before it became a wilderness area. This is where things got weird. We found a sign here for our trail that pointed directly into thick brush and bushes. This is where we knew we were a little screwed. We decided that we should just go for it anyway. We were too far to turn back now, and luckily, we had a GPS that would help guide us even without a trail. So we go through the bushes and follow what used to be a trail. We get about another mile or so down the trail before I notice bare human footprints. Let me remind you that I've been seeing bear prints and cougar prints along this trail the whole time. These were human. I put my size 11 hiking shoe over it, and they were the same size and shape, and I asked my aunt if I was going crazy, and she agreed that it was human. We walked another 500 yards down the trail, with human prints leading us to what looked like either a dump or a homeless camp. There was a tarp strung up, trash bags piled up, and garbage scattered all over next to the creek. Nope. No more investigating this creepy place in the middle of nowhere. We just hiked as fast as we could, continuing up the hill and away from that place as quickly as possible, with the eerie feeling that someone was watching us for miles. We continued the way we did, hiking with no trail for another 12 miles, until we reached a maintained trail on the other side of the pass, along with some really pretty areas that probably hadn't been seen in years. But seeing a homeless/Bigfoot camp in the middle of nowhere was not one of them. I have had a number of paranormal experiences. When I was 14, my brother left for college, and I moved into his old room. Some spooky stuff happened there. For the record, it was just me and my parents. We lived in a small town, and my friends all lived in a larger neighboring town, so no one ever came over. Anywho, as my brother left for college, I entered high school. Most of this stuff happened during my freshman year of high school. September. After moving into the room, a skull is drawn on the dust on the window pane, near where my head rests when I sleep. It was a pretty well-drawn skull. It was on the indoor side of the window, so someone had needed to enter my room to do it. It freaks me out, and I wipe it away. Several days later, it's night. I'm studying on my bed. The lights in the room make the windows look like mirrors, as such happens at night. I look up from my textbook towards the skull window, and see a white silhouette standing behind me. Shocked, I hold my gaze for 10 seconds, turn my head around to see it directly, but it's not there. I turn to the window, and it's no longer in the reflection, and I don't sleep there that night. A few weeks pass. It's 11:09 p.m., and I'm waiting for Loveline to come on the radio. My lights are off. I'm facing the same window, and a smaller, white silhouette strides past the window right in front of me, but outside. I leave, and don't sleep there for several nights. After that occurrence, I start seeing more things drawn on the windows, mostly geometric shapes. I vaguely remember a triangle thing, which gave me the creeps. But one thing I really remember, I even got a sticky note with "Draw below this" on it, and stuck it on a window. Within a few days, I found a light, perfectly drawn circle beneath the note. During all of high school, I was pretty terrified of that entire portion of the house. I would avoid it as much as possible, and I'd occasionally see dark figures out of the corner of my eye, but apparently that's a normal thing for people, so I won't put too much authority into that. Even as a child, I remember seeing colourful orbs buzzing around, though I didn't know what to think about them. But one night, during my junior year of high school, I went over to my washer/dryer, which is directly down the hall from the spooky bedroom. At that point, I'd just chosen to stop sleeping there. I look down the hall, get the normal feeling of dread, and turn my back to the hall, and bend over to empty the washing machine. I instantly lose control of my body, release my basket, stand straight up, and hear a masculine voice exhale and hiss in my ear. I regain control of my body, and run the hell out of there. I also have a couple of weird family-related things, both related to my late great-aunt. In the summer between my sophomore-junior year, my father had been having heart problems, as he had done over the past decade. My brother and I were visiting him at the hospital. My brother will bring him home tomorrow morning, and he's going to have surgery in a month. At some point, the image of my late, great-aunt pops into my mind. Something seems very significant about it. Roughly 24 hours later, I'm home with my dad, and tasked with waking him up from his nap. He's blue and cold. He never wakes up. A year or two later, it's Friday night. I'm in the recliner chair where my father passed away. My mother and I are watching TV, and I smell perfume for about a minute. Is it my mother's? No, she says. The smell dies down but picks up a few minutes later. I checked the scented candles on the fireplace, but they aren't lit and didn't smell like anything regarding this perfume. Suddenly I realize it's the same perfume that my late great-aunt wore. 2 nights later, my grandfather refuses to eat, and he dies Thursday 6 days after the phantom perfume.
One of my friends always has these get-rich-quick schemes or shady ways of making money on the side. In one of his more brilliant moves, he decides he's going to rent a house out near the country line to host illegal poker games. Anyway, this property is probably 4 or 5 acres with a tiny rundown church about 1,000 yards away on one side, and a redneck guy living in a trailer probably a quarter of a mile or so on the other side. However, the property backs up to the woods, and since it's always cheaper than the range, I and a third friend ask our renter friend if we can go shoot some guns on the property. He obliges us, and we head out there on a Saturday afternoon and find a nice barn at the tree line to go shoot into. Now we're just shooting paper targets with pistols, so we're not that far back and don't need that much room to do it. After a few magazines, we decide to venture into the woods to see how far back the property goes. We get down to the bottom of the hill and see the fluorescent ribbons that the surveyors tied to the trees to mark the property line. We realize the property is bigger than we thought, because we're about 150 to 200 yards in the woods at this point. Just as we're remarking about how big it is, we see a dead animal about 10 yards away across the property line. Walking up to examine it, we see it's a goat that's had its head cut off. Like, cleanly done by a human cut off. Then we see a severed goat head a little further away. The creepy part is it's not the same goat. The fur is different and cut differently. Imagine one head cut off a chin, and then another cut off at the shoulders. Well, we didn't stick around to see if there was a goat neck anywhere, because we realized that it wasn't decayed very much, and must have been done in the last day or two. Now, if we weren't armed, it would have been a lot scarier, but it was still creepy because I fear humans more than anything you can get out in the woods. Now, I say this was out there in the country, but it was in South Carolina, so there's not really a crazy expanse of wilderness being an East Coast state. That's pretty much all settled by people. The thing that gets me is that there was a serial killer they caught there not too long ago. This incident happened 10 years back, so perhaps he was killing animals first. I lived in a house that was haunted. My room must have been the worst area because my siblings and stepdad did hear and see things, but I got something just about every night that would happen. Constant footsteps and the feeling of being watched. Walking through my room, I'd suddenly hit spots that were freezing cold. The typical ghost signs everyone hears about in movies. But it got stranger when it followed us to our next house, and got worse to the point that my mum finally believed me when she saw a hand reaching from underneath a door right next to her. After 3 weeks of living in that house,
My cat scratched my arm pretty deeply when I picked her up, and then we didn't see her for a week. We were searching like crazy. We went back to our old house and found her inside and completely shut and locked in the boarded up house. It was an old farmhouse and we got evicted, and she was inside a closet upstairs with the door closed in on her, and the door even opened outwards, so she couldn't have closed it on herself easily. Luckily she was still alive, but nearly starved to death. Everything continued and just got worse. Hearing the thuds of someone hammering their fists on the walls would wake me up every single night, but I always would wake up at a different time. It would do 3 to wake me up. Then, as if to prove to me that it wasn't just my imagination when I woke up, it would do 1 more and stop every night. Then we found out that my mum's ex-husband had touched my brother inappropriately. A while after we found out, I was alone in my room at night. I wished that he would die, and I immediately heard a thump on the wall. He killed himself within the week. However, the spooky things didn't stop there. The first thing that ever happened at the house, actually, was shortly after we moved in, and it was one of the few times that it wasn't me it happened to. My stepdad was downstairs at the house watching TV, when we heard someone running across the floor upstairs heading towards his model train room. He thought I was still home, since I was the only one with a room upstairs. He grabbed his 2x4 that had a handle on it, and started heading towards the stairs to go paddle my ass, since I wasn't allowed in there, when he started hearing really loud thuds. He said it was like someone was up there knocking bureaus and throwing his boxes of trains. He said he began yelling, and it kept going. Then halfway up the stairs it got dead quiet, and he started to think that it wasn't me, since I didn't answer when he called. So he went back downstairs and got his gun. When he went back, everything was exactly how it was left. This was the only reason he started believing me when things happened. My mum wasn't convinced at all. Every night I heard footsteps on the ceiling above my room, without fail. There would be also a lot of thuds that sounded like they were coming from random spots on my wall. There was one night where it was happening every time I would finally think it was over. Just set slow thuds over and over again, 2 to 4 at a time, pausing every few seconds between each knock. My mum heard it from their bedroom and was relatively close by one when I had already fallen asleep, and sent Shane to come and yell at me. But on his way over he could hear the knocking right on the door of my bedroom. He opened it and I was passed out on my bed. I woke up to him listening to the wall, trying to find out where the noise was coming from, at about 3 a.m. One day, I was with my brother downstairs, switching off while playing Big Muth the Truckers, and we heard running footsteps coming from my room. My brother hadn't any experiences with it, even though his room is directly beneath mine, and he got really nervous when I casually mentioned that it was the ghost, and would stop if we ignored it. Being a mean older brother, and having gotten used to it, I offered to go investigate with him. Again, he stopped on our way up the stairs. My brother was so scared at this point. He brought a steak knife with him. And to give you an idea of the surroundings, my room at the time was absolutely huge. Like, so big that I just arranged my furniture to only use half of it, because I didn't have much stuff. On the side of the room I didn't use, there was a closet that I always covered up with a sheet, because it made me nervous at night, with all the noises going on. When we walked through the doorway, the first thing we noticed was that the sheet was blown way up into the air, even through there, despite the fact that there was no wind in the room, and no window was open upstairs. By this point I was too afraid, and my brother was running down the stairs before the sheet had time to settle. For some reason I had courage that day and went to take a look. But when I got close, I could hear scratching as well as relieved thinking that it was just the cat. But I looked around the inside and couldn't see her, but could still hear the scratching. It sounded just like a cat trying to get through an open door. When I listened closely, I could hear it coming from the left wall, and I put my hand on the wall and felt it move. And then I realized that it wasn't the wall, and it was just one of those boards that you would put tool hangers on and stuff, where it has all those tiny holes all throughout the board that the legs of the hangers insert into. When it fell away, I felt a freezing burst of air to my face that sent me running out of the house. When my parents finally got home, we went and looked at it. There was a small crevice behind it that was probably about 3 foot high and a couple of feet deep. All I could picture was my imagination, with a 5-year-old kid curled up and hiding in there. The next time my family was gone, I boarded the damn thing up with plywood and covered it up with a sheet. But every now and then, I would see the sheet kick up, like there was a breeze coming through it. One morning months after this, I woke up and my arm was itching like crazy. I felt a bit of a jump with my hand and thought it was mosquito bite, but then I realized it wasn't just a little round bug bite. It was like a bump forming a line. So I finally sat up and pulled my shirt off to look at where I had felt it. On my left bicep right below my shoulders, there was a red mark in the shape of a hand. I really don't know how to explain it, but it was pretty much indented on my skin, and the bump I felt was the outline. The hand was tiny and only had 3 fingers and a thumb, but it didn't look like it was missing a finger. It just looked like it had the hand that only was supposed to have 3 fingers. I would say it wasn't much bigger than a 10-year-old's hand. It was also a left hand print from what I could tell. I sat there for at least 15 minutes trying to lay my hand on it in a way that would match up, but it didn't seem possible. It was still bright red when I decided to leave my room for the second time, and I got downstairs to show my mother, but it was gone. I had thought for sure that she would believe me if she had seen it. Then we moved into a second house, and things died down for 3 to 4 weeks, until my mum was working with my stepdad on our bathroom, and she was sitting on the floor just outside the door, passing tools and such. She noticed a hand reaching under the door to my brother's room. She thought it was my brother trying to scare her, so she quickly opens the door to bonk him on the head. But, just like before, he was in his bed fast asleep, all the way on the other side of the room. She finally believed me after that. It was only 2 to 3 days after this that the cat went missing, and we found her in the old house locked in the closet. Things started back up again with the footsteps and thumping. A lot of stuff happened in between. I was stressed and depressed, about as far as anyone could possibly go. I was constantly berated at school, and had recently been beaten up by 5 of those kids. I was getting hit and verbally abused about daily, but my arsehat stepfather had to work on the farm almost all the time, before and after school, and had recently found out that my brother had been touched inappropriately by my previous stepfather. I was never touched to that level, but some things came to light in my mind that still haunt me. And the year before, my best friend / brother had died of cancer. I was only 13, but I really wanted life to end at that point. I went out to our big barn in the middle of the night and got a rope. On the second floor of the barn was a huge window. I was sitting on the window crying when I got cold and looked behind me. I could see someone standing in the corner of the barn. I saw that often in the barns, but always out of the corner of my eye. This time I stared.
I must have sat there staring for a solid 2 minutes, and I started calmly talking, telling it how much I didn't care anymore. I taunted it. I wanted it to push me out the window so I didn't have to do it myself. It just stood there completely black and completely silent. Eventually, I just got angry and told it to piss off, and that I'm done with everything. And so I went back inside, and that's when I grabbed the 2x4 and just went into my parents' room and hit him as hard as I could with it. I was a coward, so I only hit his arm, but he woke up and I ran. He chased me outside in his boxers and grabbed the first thing that he could see, one of those adjustable wrenches, and threw it at my back, but I kept on running. My mum finally left him when I told her that I had been thinking about ending it all. Well, she left him for about a month before they got back together. But what it did accomplish was moving far away from that area for good, and when they got back together, he moved to where we were living. I haven't been haunted, except for 2 strange dreams that were ridiculously vivid out-of-body experiences, where I came back to find a girl that was with me in my bed. She was being ripped apart by a completely black, small figure of a boy. They just looked and felt so real. I remember feeling burning on my arm and feeling the warmth of blood getting on my face. When I walked into the room, but nothing else had actually happened, except for when I went back to the farm earlier this year during the summer, which was very unsettling, as I'm still confused as to what the hell was going on there.
I am 16. This happened the 8th of July, 2016. I live in Massachusetts, which is where this happened. The day started normally. I went to school, had a test in vet tech, as I go to a technical high school, and one of its classes is vet tech, and I took the bus home. Both of my parents were at work like normal, but after 3 hours when my mum should have been home, I got worried. About 5 p.m. I got a call from my dad, who told me my mum was in a car accident, and that they are both in the hospital, and would be there for a while. It got very late, almost 10, and my parents weren't home, so I decided to put my younger brothers to bed. I stayed up, waiting for my parents to get home, and I spent my time reading and writing an essay for school until around 1 a.m. I got a call from my dad who said he wasn't coming home. He was staying in a motel that was closer to the hospital. I got off the phone and finished the part of the essay I was on. I gathered my stuff and walked through the kitchen, heading towards the stairs that led upstairs, when a moaning sound reached my ears. The moaning came from outside. It was really loud, and stopped occasionally, like whatever was making the sound voice was cracking. It sounded pained. I turned on the outside light to see an ugly sight. Sitting in the yard just a few feet from the house was a coyote. It was horribly injured. Its head was partially caved in on the left side, its paw was bleeding, and this was evident by the pool of blood with the paw in the direct middle. It appeared that it had a long deep gash all the way down its back, and all of the wounds were bleeding. I reached for my pocket, trying to get my phone, only to realize I had left it on the table I'd been working on. I turned and rushed back to the table. I was planning to call a local vet clinic that I knew was open 24/7. When I reached the table, the moaning got much louder and more pained. Then it stopped. I grabbed my phone and ran back to the window. At first I was confused. The coyote was gone, replaced by a common tabby cat. It was odd. The cat was sitting directly in the same place the coyote had been. After the initial shock, I noticed that the tabby cat had the same injuries. Same bleeding paw, same caved-in head, and the same gnashes down its back. Something was different, however. I couldn't pinpoint the difference for a good 3 minutes. Then I realized that the right shoulder blade was kind of pointing out at a completely unnatural angle. It looked deformed and painful, and I dropped my phone as soon as I noticed this. When my phone hit the floor, the cat began meowing loudly. I stared at it as it meowed and stared right back at me. It was looking directly at me, unblinking. After a good while, I slowly picked up my phone off the floor. I straightened back up and looked out the window, and the cat was gone. I had only looked away for a few seconds, and in that short time, the horribly injured cat had vanished. Some unknown feeling made me go outside to look for the cat. I don't know what it was. Worry? Perhaps curiosity. Hell, it might have been something the animal made me feel. I have no clue. Now outside, I first walked to the puddle of blood and looked for a trail of it. I found it and started to follow the trail, and found that it ended as soon as it passed the gate. To make sure that I could see it in the dark, I pulled out my phone and illuminated the ground around me. I looked around for 5 minutes, but didn't see anything. Just like the cat, the trail had also vanished. I called the veterinary clinic, and they sent out a car, and they looked around, but the trail was gone, and they couldn't find it. At the time, I didn't think of this until afterwards, but I realized that there was no trail of blood leading to my house. I have no idea what the hell this thing was. None of my searches have turned up any results close to what I saw. I am completely convinced that the coyote and the cat were the same creature, and that it is neither a coyote nor a cat. Afterwards, I asked around, and there were no records of dead cats or coyotes turning up with injuries. The creature couldn't get far with those wounds that it had. Does anyone have any ideas of what I saw? So this happened to me on Thursday, April 25th, and I still can't shake off how terrifying and strange it was. So I was home alone getting ready for my midday college class that morning, and I opened my blinds to let some natural light in. I glanced out my window to see a man in his mid-30s wearing a baseball cap, roaming around my property, with his hands on his hips, walking around with a lot of weird confidence. But our yard is kind of like a cliff, and it looks over onto our 5 acres of property down below. I live in the Pacific Northwest, so it's a pretty scenic view. I was really confused, and thought maybe it was a worker that my mum had hired for our renovations on the house, who was admiring the view. I'm a little bit uncomfortable at this point, because the dude walks to the side of my house out of sight. I head upstairs to see him now roaming around my front yard and my driveway, looking at things, checking out my house, and he still hasn't seen me at this point. I call my dad and ask him if we have hired anyone to come by the house, and he says not that he knows of, and tells me he's going to call my mum and ask her, and then call me back. I'm waiting for the call, when I notice this strange dude's car. It's a white Honda with no license plates, just parked parallel to my front door. The dude still hasn't seen me, and he's still wandering around. So I take this as an opportunity to remember that we have a security system and I armed it. So if he did try to break in, it would immediately alert the police. If this was some sort of professional or worker, he would have rung my doorbell or knocked at least once. He did neither. Just then I get a call back from my dad, saying neither him or my mum hired anyone to come by today, and that I need to call our local police station immediately. I went back downstairs after making sure to lock every door and window upstairs, and called my city's police station. I explained to a woman on the other end what is happening, and she decides that she's not going to send an officer out, and instead gives me a number to call their emergency dispatch line and told me to talk to them. I call the number she gives me, and immediately I get an automated message saying, "Thank you for calling the non-emergency hotline. Nobody is available today to take your call. If this is an emergency, please hang up and dial 911. At this point, I'm really irritated, because 15 minutes had passed, and this weird dude is still lurking around my house while I'm home alone, and apparently that wasn't enough to warrant an emergency to the lady I called. I hung up and decided to call 911. After getting in touch with the 911 operator, I was asked a series of questions about his appearance before they would even alert officers near me to start heading towards my house. The whole thing really seemed weird. Nobody was in a hurry to have officers come up to my place when I was a young girl home alone with a strange dude. I asked the officer if I should stay on the line with her when she finally, after what seemed like forever, alerted the police to come to where I was, and she agreed, and I went back upstairs to check on the weird guy. And he's now sitting in his unplated Honda, either listening to the radio show extremely loud, or on a phone call with someone through his car. It was a very prominent loud male voice coming from his car. Then all of a sudden, I heard the tone you hear when someone hangs up on you, and the operator was no longer on the line. I was really confused when my thoughts were interrupted by an unrecognized phone number calling me. I assumed it was the operator calling me back, so I picked up. Instead, I was greeted by really creepy heavy breathing. I'm not sure who, but it really freaked me out. I hung up immediately, dialed back 911. I had been pretty calm up until this point, but that phone call put me in panic mode. I got on the phone with another operator who already knew my situation and address before I could even explain it. She said the cops were on their way. 20 minutes had passed at this point. The dude is still here in his car and the cops are not. Keep in mind I live in a smaller town, so there's no reason why it took the cops as long as it did. Finally, this dude is leaving my driveway right as the cops pull up. They ask him a few questions. The cop then comes to my door and hands me a sketchy-looking flyer saying it was just a landscaper. He said he had an appointment. I was really relieved and irritated that it was just a dude my mum had hired. I called my mum back and said the cop said it was just a landscaper that you hired and that he had an appointment. She goes, "I can assure you, we never hired a landscaper. We don't even need one." So creepy dude, who was posing to try and rob our house, let's not meet again. In the late summer of 2012, I snuck into an abandoned tuberculosis hospital with a friend. This was Sarah. She had a voice recorder with her, and I had a cheap video camera. Once we had gotten inside the basement, we both hit record at the same time. As we made our way up floor by floor, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, but upon checking behind me there was nothing. We continued on. The building wasn't very big, thankfully. We reached the top floor and began to look around. Sarah asked a few more questions, and I did as well. I still couldn't shake the feeling of being followed, and I kept glancing behind me, as well as looking around. After a few minutes, we decided to leave and make our way down the steps, and we ended up back at the basement. As soon as we hit the basement, the feeling of being followed stopped, and I could relax. We left the building and went home that night. A few days later, a friend of mine that had went with us, but didn't go inside, asked if I'd watched the video. I said I hadn't, but we would check it out. I put the SD card into my computer and began to watch it. The video itself was pretty dark, and you couldn't really see anything other than my flashlight beam bouncing off walls. When it got to the part where we had reached the second floor, I caught something on that camera that I will never forget. In the video, Sarah asked, "If you're trapped here and you want to leave, please speak into this little red light." Not a second passed before there was a response. "Ain't no light." I turned and looked at my friend wide-eyed, and she looked pale. I knew then we had both heard the same thing. I immediately called Sarah and asked her to meet me. When I met her and played the clip back, she immediately went pale herself. She dug out her voice recorder and listened to the same section matching up with my camera. There was no voice. It was only her and I in the building, and this voice was in my video and not in her voice recorder. It was a gruff male voice, and clear, like the person spoke directly into my camera microphone loudly. So I was right. There was someone following us that day. This is a story that my dad told me not too long ago about my grandpa and how he came extremely close to being murdered. My grandpa used to be a pastor at a local church, and one night when he was driving home from a service and was wearing his robes and collar, he saw a hitchhiker on the side of the road and decided to pull over and pick him up, like he usually would when he saw a hitchhiker. He pulled over and the man got in. The man was wearing overalls and was also carrying an old metal lunchbox with him. My grandpa assumed he was a construction worker who did not have a ride home after a shift. My grandpa and him started to converse and eventually arrived at the man's destination. The man got out and thanked my grandpa for the ride. A few days later, my grandpa was talking to his neighbor. At one point in the conversation, she brought up a story she had seen on the news about a man who would get rides from people by hitchhiking. Then he would reach his destination, would take out a knife out of his old metal lunchbox, and finish the life of the person driving. My grandpa almost fainted after hearing this news. He assumed the only reason he was alive and talking to her was because of the robes and collar he was wearing. When I was 17, I saw the scariest thing in my life. My parents went out of town for the weekend, which wasn't a big deal for me, as they did that all the time. Well, I was home alone one Friday night at around 9 or 10 o'clock, and was starting to get a mild headache. My dad always kept the ibuprofen on his nightstand next to his bed, so I went to get some. When I turned on the light to the bedroom, I saw a black figure about 3 feet in height and 4 feet in front of me. I know this sounds cheesy, but it had horns on its head kind of like Batman, and long skinny feet. It moved so fluidly, like a mixture of smoke and water. I watched it run from in front of me around the bed and into the wall. The wall was the one wall I shared with my bedroom. I had other experiences in that apartment, but that one was by far the creepiest.